The moment I saw my 8-year-old son's blue lips, I knew. But when he whispered what my mother and sister had done, making him stand outside in the freezing snow, face pressed against the window, watching his cousins open presents while they smiled at his tears, something inside me didn't just break. It ignited. See, they thought I'd forgotten. They thought 28 years of gaslighting had erased the memory of 7-year-old me standing on that same frozen porch while Grandma Eleanor's voice echoed through the glass. This is how we learn gratitude, dear. But here's what my perfect sister Victoria didn't know: Grandma Eleanor left me everything. The house, the investments, nearly $500,000. And the will came with a clause that would change everything. That night, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I did something they never saw coming. I picked up my phone and made 3 calls. First to the bank, freezing every account I'd been quietly funding for 15 years. Second to my lawyer about that inheritance clause they'd been secretly plotting around. Third to my brother Daniel, who'd been recording their schemes for the past 3 years. By morning, my phone had 120 missed calls. My mother, my sister, relatives I hadn't heard from in years, all panicking, because they finally realized the family scapegoat they'd been breaking for decades. She wasn't broken anymore, and what I was about to do would expose everything: the lies, the manipulation, the dark family secret that explained why they'd tortured me for so long. This is the story of how I burned down their perfect world, using nothing but the truth. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 35 years old, and until last Christmas Eve, I thought I'd successfully buried the worst parts of my childhood. I work as a financial analyst at a mid-sized firm in Portland, raising my 8-year-old son Connor on my own since my divorce 3 years ago. I'd convinced myself that being the family peacekeeper, the one who always smiled and nodded and never caused problems, was just who I was naturally. I had no idea it was survival training that started before I could even remember. The moment I pulled up to my sister Victoria's house that night, I should have known something was wrong. The December air had that particular bitter quality that cuts right through your coat, and fat snowflakes were falling steadily under the streetlights. I was running 20 minutes late picking up Connor because of a last-minute client call, feeling that familiar guilt that working mothers know so well. I'd texted Victoria to let her know, and she'd responded with a cheerful, "No problem, Connor's having a wonderful time." But when Connor came down the front steps toward my car, he wasn't wearing his winter coat. He had on only the thin pullover sweater he'd worn inside, and even from the driver's seat I could see he was shivering violently. His lips had that grayish-blue tinge that every mother recognizes with instant alarm. I threw the car into park and jumped out, already shrugging off my own coat to wrap around his small shoulders. "Connor, baby, where's your jacket? How long have you been outside?" My hands were shaking as I rubbed his arms, trying to generate warmth. He wouldn't meet my eyes. That's when Victoria appeared in the doorway, backlit by the warm glow of her picture-perfect home. She was wearing a cashmere sweater in festive red, her blonde hair perfect, that smile I'd seen my whole life plastered across her face. "Oh, good you're here. Connor was just getting a little fresh air before you arrived. Weren't you, sweetie?" Something about her tone made my stomach clench. "Victoria, it's 28 degrees out here. He's freezing." "Well, children need to learn to appreciate warmth, don't they?" She said it so lightly, so casually, as if she were discussing the weather itself. It was just a teaching moment. I had him watch through the window for a little while, see everyone inside enjoying the party. Helps them understand gratitude, you know, just like Grandma Eleanor taught us. She paused, and her smile widened just a fraction. "You remember, don't you, Sarah?" The world tilted. I actually felt dizzy standing there in the falling snow with my son pressed against me. Victoria's words hung in the air like poison, and suddenly I couldn't breathe properly. I managed to get Connor into the car, buckled into his booster seat, and I think I said something to Victoria, some automatic pleasantry that my well-trained mouth produced without my brain's involvement. Then I was behind the wheel, pulling away from that house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. The drive home was only 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. My mind kept trying to surface something, some memory that had been pushed down so deep I'd almost convinced myself it never happened. Flashes of images disjointed and dreamlike. A younger me, maybe 7 years old, in a pink winter coat that I'd loved standing on a porch. Cold seeping through my boots. The sound of laughter from inside. My mother's face visible through a window, talking animatedly with someone not looking my way. And Victoria, even then, the golden child at 10 years old, glancing toward me with that same smile I'd just seen on her adult face. Connor's small voice cut through the spiraling memories. "Mom. Yes, honey." I tried to keep my voice steady. Why did Grandma Victoria smile at me like that when I was cold? He was looking down at his hands, picking at a loose thread on his sweater. Like she was happy. The word happy hit me like a physical blow. Because that's exactly what it had been. Not accidental, not thoughtless, intentional, calculated. A methodology passed down like a family recipe. When we got home, I went through all the motions on autopilot. I made Connor hot chocolate, ran him a warm bath, tucked him into bed with extra blankets. I told him we'd talk more tomorrow, that everything was okay, all the lies that mothers tell to protect their children from truths too big to process. Then, when the house was finally quiet, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years. I went to the hall closet where I kept the boxes of old family photos, the ones I'd been meaning to organize or scan, or just throw away for the better part of a decade. My hands were still shaking as I opened the first album. There were the expected photos. Christmas mornings, birthday parties, family vacations. Everyone smiling. Everyone looking happy. The perfect family. But then I found it tucked in the middle of my 8th birthday party photos. There I was, a small figure in a purple birthday dress standing outside the sliding glass door. My face was pressed against the glass, and you could see the party happening inside. Grandma Eleanor was cutting the cake. My mother was laughing. Victoria was holding a present. And I was outside alone. What made my breath catch wasn't just the photo itself. It was the caption written in my grandmother's distinctive looping handwriting on the white border of the Polaroid teaching moment. Sarah learns gratitude, 1995. This wasn't a one-time incident. This wasn't even Victoria's invention. This was a family tradition passed down like a curse, like a twisted inheritance more powerful than any money or property. And I had been so thoroughly conditioned, so completely gaslit, that I'd erased my own suffering from memory. I'd rewritten my childhood to make it bearable, to make myself small enough to fit into the role they'd assigned me. But Connor's blue lips were real. His shivering had been real. And Victoria's smile, that satisfied knowing smile, was the same one I'd seen on Grandma Eleanor's face in my recovered memories. They weren't just similar. They were following the same script. And my son had just been cast in the role I'd played my entire childhood. That's when I knew everything was about to change. The 3 days following my discovery of that photograph passed in a strange dissociative haze. I went through the motions of my normal life, dropping Connor at school, attending meetings at work, preparing dinners, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. I kept replaying that smile on Victoria's face, kept seeing the caption in Grandma Eleanor's handwriting, kept feeling the weight of all those buried memories pressing against the carefully constructed walls I'd built around them. Connor seemed quieter than usual, more withdrawn, and every time I looked at him, I felt a fresh wave of something I was only beginning to recognize as rage. On the third day, a Thursday afternoon, I came home to find a notice from the post office tucked into my door. Certified mail requiring signature. I drove to the post office during my lunch break the next day, signed for the thick, cream-colored envelope, and sat in my car in the parking lot to open it. The return address read, Whitman and Associates Estate Attorneys, in elegant, embossed lettering. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the letter inside. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind that whispered of old money and established institutions. The text was formal, almost archaic in its phrasing, but the content made my stomach drop. "Dear Ms. Mitchell," it began, "regarding the estate of Eleanor Mitchell, deceased. As per the terms of her will, certain information will be disclosed to you upon your 36th birthday, which our records indicate will occur in 11 months' time. This letter serves as formal notification of this pending disclosure. Please confirm receipt and verify that your current contact information remains accurate. Should you have any questions regarding this matter, please contact our office during business hours. The disclosure cannot be expedited or discussed prior to the specified date, as per the explicit instructions of the deceased." I read it 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Grandma Eleanor had died 2 years ago in January, just after the New Year. I remembered the funeral, the gray winter day, the reading of the will. She'd left small amounts to various charities, some personal items distributed among family members. I'd received a set of her gardening books, which had seemed oddly specific since I'd never shown any interest in gardening. The house had gone to my mother, or so I'd assumed. The estate had been settled. Everything had been finalized. Hadn't it? Why would there be information that couldn't be disclosed until my birthday? What kind of provision was so time-sensitive, so particular, that it required this kind of elaborate delay? I sat in my car for 20 minutes, staring at that letter before I finally pulled out my phone and called my mother. Patricia answered on the 4th ring, her voice carrying that false brightness she used when she was hosting her book club or talking to people at church. "Sarah, darling, what a nice surprise." "Mom, I just got a letter from Grandma's estate attorneys." I tried to keep my voice neutral, just curious, not accusatory. "Something about information being disclosed on my birthday. Did you know about this?" The pause that followed was just a beat too long. When Patricia spoke again, her voice had changed, tightened somehow like a string pulled taut. "Oh, that. Yes, your grandmother had some very particular ideas about when certain things should be revealed. You know how she was always so meticulous about everything." Another pause. "It's really nothing to worry about, dear. Just some old paperwork, probably some sentimental items she wanted you to have at a specific age. She could be quite theatrical about these things." The explanation was smooth, practiced almost, but something in her tone struck me as wrong. Patricia sounded nervous, which was unusual. My mother was many things, but nervous wasn't typically one of them. But why the specific date? Why my 36th birthday? How should I know your grandmother's reasoning was her own? Patricia's voice sharpened, slightly irritation creeping in. "How is Connor doing? By the way, Victoria mentioned he seemed a bit emotional at Christmas. She was concerned about him." The subject change was so abrupt it was almost comical, and the fact that she was bringing up Connor, framing Victoria's cruelty as concern, made something hot and bitter rise in my throat. "Connor is fine," I said carefully. "Actually, Mom, I wanted to talk to you about what happened at Victoria's. Did she tell you that she made him stand outside in the snow?" "Sarah." My mother's voice took on that particular tone I knew so well, the one that said I was being difficult, oversensitive, dramatic. "It was a teaching moment. We all went through similar experiences growing up. It builds character, resilience. You turned out just fine, didn't you?" "Did I?" The question came out before I could stop it, sharp and challenging in a way I never spoke to my mother. The silence that followed was arctic. When Patricia spoke again, her voice was cold and clipped. "Stop being so paranoid, Sarah. You always overthink everything. This is exactly why your grandmother probably put conditions on whatever she left you. You get yourself worked up over nothing and create drama where there isn't any." She paused, and I could hear her taking a breath, recomposing herself. "I have to go. Garden club meeting in 20 minutes. We'll talk later." She hung up before I could respond. I sat there in the post office parking lot, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dead air. You always overthink everything. How many times had I heard that? How many times had my legitimate concerns, my questions, my attempts to understand been dismissed with those exact words? That evening, after putting Connor to bed, I couldn't shake the conversation. Patricia's nervousness, her quick deflection, the odd comment about conditions on what Grandma Eleanor had left me. I'd assumed I wasn't getting anything of real value, hence the gardening books. But what if there was more? What if that letter from the attorneys meant something significant? I found myself thinking about the storage unit where I'd hastily shoved boxes from Grandma's house after the funeral. I'd been meaning to go through them for 2 years now, but I'd kept putting it off, telling myself I was too busy, that I'd get to it eventually. Now suddenly, it felt urgent. The storage facility was open until 9. I grabbed my keys and drove across town, letting myself into the climate-controlled unit I'd been paying $75 a month for without really thinking about it. The boxes were stacked neatly in the back, labeled in my own handwriting, Eleanor Kitchen, Eleanor Books, Eleanor Personal. I pulled down the box marked Personal and sat on the concrete floor using my phone flashlight to illuminate the contents. Old photo albums I'd already looked through. A jewelry box containing costume pieces, nothing valuable. Scarves and handkerchiefs carefully folded. And then at the very bottom, beneath layers of tissue paper and old linens, a sealed envelope. Cream-colored like the one from the attorneys, but this one had Eleanor's handwriting across the front in bold black ink. To Sarah, open only when you're ready to stop letting them rewrite your story. My heart was pounding as I carefully opened the envelope, trying not to tear the paper. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, the kind with Eleanor's monogram at the top, and a letter written in her distinctive slanting script. The date at the top was marked 1 month before her death. My dearest Sarah, it began, and I had to blink back sudden tears, because I could hear her voice in those words, precise and formal, the way she always was. If you're reading this, you've started questioning the narrative they've built around you. Good. That questioning is the first step toward freedom. I chose you as my primary beneficiary because you're the only one with the strength to break what I started. I know that doesn't make sense yet. It will soon. My hands shook as I continued reading. I have so many regrets, but the deepest is this: I taught your mother the wrong lessons. I believe that hardship created strength, that withholding warmth built resilience, that love should be earned rather than freely given. I was wrong. So profoundly, devastatingly wrong. Patricia learned too well, and Victoria has inherited that same sickness. But you somehow stayed kind. You stayed soft in all the ways that matter. You have a chance to break this pattern, Sarah. Forgive me for teaching your mother what she's done to you. Don't let her do to Connor what I did to her and what she did to you. The inheritance I'm leaving you isn't just money or property. It's choice. The choice to walk away, the choice to protect your son, the choice to stop the cycle. Use it well. I sat there on the storage unit floor, tears streaming down my face, reading and rereading those words. Primary beneficiary. The choice to walk away. She knew. Grandma Eleanor had known what was happening, what had always been happening, and she'd tried to give me a way out. My phone rang, the sound jarring in the quiet space. Victoria's name flashed across the screen. I stared at it for 3 rings before I answered. Mom said you got something from Grandma's lawyer. Victoria's voice was casual, but there was an edge underneath it, something sharp and hungry. What did it say? I told Victoria the letter was just administrative paperwork, some formality about Grandma's estate that needed my signature. My voice sounded calm, almost bored, even though my hands were still shaking from reading Eleanor's letter. Victoria made a small noise of acknowledgement, said something about how Grandma always did complicate simple things, and hung up after reminding me that Mom's birthday was coming up and we should coordinate on a gift. The audacity of that normalcy, the assumption that everything would just continue as it always had, left me breathless. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Eleanor's words circling through my mind. Primary beneficiary, the choice to walk away. The inheritance I'm leaving you isn't just money or property. What exactly had she left me? And why had she structured it this way, with this mysterious 11-month waiting period? But underneath those questions was something else, something that had been growing since I found that childhood photograph. A need to understand the full scope of what had been done to me, what I had allowed to be done to me. I got up at 2 a.m, went to my home office, and opened my laptop. I started pulling up bank records going back as far as the digital archives would let me. 15 years of statements, transfers, loan documents. What I found over the next week of late-night excavation made me physically ill. The numbers were staggering. I'd always known I helped my mother financially, had co-signed some loans for Victoria, contributed to family expenses. But I'd thought of it in isolated incidents, individual acts of support. 1,000 here, 2,000 there. I'd never added it up, never looked at the cumulative impact. Now, with spreadsheets laid out in front of me, the truth was undeniable. $127,000 in direct transfers to my mother over 15 years. The descriptions varied: emergency car repair, medical bills, property tax assistance, temporary help with mortgage. Temporary. That word appeared dozens of times, but the payments never stopped. They just got renamed. $43,000 in co-signed loans for Victoria. Her car when she turned 30. The home equity line of credit for her kitchen renovation. The personal loan when Marcus's business had a rough quarter. I was still making payments on 2 of those loans, and Victoria had never paid me back a single dollar. Then there were the smaller amounts, the ones I'd almost forgotten. Family reunion deposits, contributions to cousin weddings, Mom's 60th birthday party at the country club that I'd somehow ended up funding entirely. Gifts for nieces and nephews that Victoria selected and I paid for. The tally of these smaller expenses added another $18,000 to the total, nearly $200,000. Money I'd earned working overtime, taking extra clients, sacrificing time with Connor. Money that had flowed out of my accounts and into theirs, like I was nothing more than a reliable ATM. And yet at every family gathering, at every holiday meal, Victoria was the one praised. "Victoria is so good to Mom," the aunts would say. "Victoria really takes care of the family." I was the one who was too busy with her career, the one who could make more time for family if she really wanted to. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They needed me quiet. They needed me grateful for whatever scraps of approval they tossed my way. They needed me just visible enough to be useful, just present enough to keep funding their lives, but never confident enough to question why it was always my money, my time, my sacrifice. I'd been funding my own diminishment, paying for the privilege of being treated as less than. I spent that entire weekend in a strange state of clarity. I called my bank on Monday morning and canceled the automatic transfer to my mother's account, the one that had been running for 7 years. I contacted the credit union and had myself removed as co-signer on Victoria's credit line. I set up email filters to automatically archive any messages with loan or emergency in the subject line from family addresses. And then I did something that felt both terrifying and liberating. I went silent. I didn't call to explain. I didn't send an email justifying my decision. I didn't apologize or provide reasons or try to soften the blow. I simply stopped. When my phone started ringing Tuesday afternoon, I let it go to voicemail. When it rang again an hour later, I did the same thing. By Tuesday evening, I had 15 missed calls. By Wednesday morning, 27. I listened to the voicemails once, chronicling the evolution. The first ones were concerned. "Sarah, honey, there seems to be a problem with the bank transfer. Can you call me?" By the 5th or 6th concern had shifted to confusion with an edge of irritation. "Sarah, I've called several times now. This isn't like you." By the 10th, the mask was slipping. "Sarah, I don't know what game you're playing, but this is extremely inconsiderate. Your mother depends on that money for her expenses." Thursday brought a new wave. Victoria called 6 times in one afternoon. Her voicemails progressed from sweetly bewildered to coldly furious with remarkable speed. "Sarah, I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding, but the credit union called about the co-signer change and I need you to call them back and fix this immediately." An hour later, "Sarah, this is affecting my credit. Whatever point you're trying to make, this is not the way to handle it." By Friday evening, I had 37 missed calls. My mother, Victoria's husband Marcus, Aunt Linda, even a cousin I hadn't spoken to in 5 years. The voicemails had moved past anger into something that sounded almost like panic. "Sarah, we need to talk about this immediately. You're putting your mother in a very difficult position. Call me back tonight." But what struck me most wasn't who was calling. It was who wasn't. Daniel. My younger brother. 33 years old and perpetually on the periphery of family drama, had sent exactly one text message on Wednesday. "I know why you're not answering them." No demands, no guilt trips, just acknowledgement. It was the first communication from my family in years that didn't want something from me. On Saturday morning, another text from Daniel arrived. "Sunday dinner at Mom's. They're planning something. Don't go alone." I stared at that message for a long time. They're planning something. Of course they were. I'd disrupted the system, stopped the flow of resources they'd come to see as their due. They wouldn't just let that go. They'd strategize, organize, create a situation designed to put me back in my place. My hands were shaking as I typed back, "What are they planning?" The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. When Daniel's response finally came through, my stomach dropped. "An intervention. They're bringing witnesses." I spent Sunday morning preparing myself, mentally running through scenarios, trying to anticipate what they would say and how I would respond. Daniel had offered to come with me, but something told me I needed to face this alone. If I brought backup, they'd use it as evidence that I was the one being divisive, that I was the problem. I needed to walk into whatever they had planned and trust myself to see it clearly for what it was. I arrived at my mother's house at exactly 2 o'clock. The driveway was already full, which should have been my first warning. Patricia's sedan, Victoria's SUV, Marcus's truck, and 2 other cars I didn't immediately recognize. This wasn't a family dinner. This was something else entirely. Patricia opened the door before I could knock, her expression a careful mixture of relief and concern. "Sarah, sweetheart, thank you for coming. Everyone's in the living room." Everyone. Not, "We're in the living room," or "Come have some coffee." Everyone. Like I was arriving late to a meeting that had already started without me. I followed her down the familiar hallway past the gallery wall of family photos where Victoria's children smiled from every other frame while Connor appeared in maybe 1 out of 10. The living room had been rearranged since I'd last been here. The furniture was positioned in a way that felt wrong, deliberate. The sofa and 2 armchairs formed a semicircle, all facing the single chair that had been pulled from the dining room and placed opposite them. Patricia and Victoria sat on the sofa. Marcus occupied one armchair, his expression carefully neutral. And in the other chair sat Reverend Matthews from our church, a kind-faced man in his 60s who had baptized Connor and presided over countless family services. Next to him, perched on a dining chair that had been brought in to accommodate the expanded seating, was Helen Garrison, my mother's closest friend since college, a woman I'd known my entire life. The setup was so obvious it was almost comical. This wasn't a family dinner. This was a tribunal, and I was the defendant. The religious authority and the family friend were there to add moral weight, to serve as supposedly neutral witnesses to whatever narrative had been prepared. They were there to make me feel outnumbered, judged, compelled by social pressure to comply. Victoria stood as I entered, moving toward me with practiced grace. She pulled me into a hug that felt like a performance, holding just long enough to seem genuine to observers, while whispering near my ear, "I'm so glad you came. We've all been so worried." The words were pitched perfectly for the room to hear, positioning her as the concerned sister me as the worrying problem. "Please sit down, Sarah." Patricia gestured to the single chair facing everyone else. Of course, the arrangement wasn't accidental. They'd positioned me like a defendant before a jury, isolated, outnumbered, visually separated from the unified front they presented. I sat, placing my purse on the floor beside me, keeping my hands folded in my lap. My heart was racing, but I forced my breathing to stay steady. I would not let them see me rattled. Reverend Matthews cleared his throat gently. "Sarah, your mother asked me to be here today because your family is concerned about you. I hope you know this comes from a place of love." Victoria took over then, and I realized with a sinking sensation that she'd prepared for this. Really prepared. She leaned forward, her expression radiating empathy and worry in equal measure. "Sarah, we asked Reverend Matthews here, and Helen too, because we're genuinely concerned about some behavioral changes we've been seeing. Concerning changes." She let that word hang in the air. Concerning. As if I were the problem, the source of instability. "In the past 2 weeks, you've cut off Mom financially without any explanation or warning. She depends on that support for her living expenses, and suddenly it just stopped." Victoria's voice was measured reasonable, tinged with just the right amount of hurt. "You've been refusing all our calls. Dozens of calls, Sarah. From Mom, from me, from family members who care about you. And we've also heard from Connor's school that you've been asking about changing his emergency contacts to remove family members." Each statement was technically true. That was the genius of it. She wasn't lying, she was just stripping away all context, all nuance, all the reasons behind my actions. She was taking facts and reshaping them into a narrative where I was the villain. Then Victoria did something that genuinely shocked me. She reached beside the sofa and pulled out a folder. An actual folder professionally organized with printed documentation inside. She opened it carefully, showing the contents to Reverend Matthews and Helen like a lawyer presenting evidence. "This is documentation of the support Sarah provided over the years, which she's now withdrawn without warning. This is a record of the calls and messages she's ignored. This shows the changes she's requested at Connor's school." Victoria's voice caught slightly perfectly timed. "We're not trying to attack you, Sarah. We're trying to understand. You're pushing us away, and we don't know why." Reverend Matthews looked genuinely troubled. "Sarah, family is sacred. Whatever conflict has arisen, surely it can be worked through with communication and forgiveness. Can you help us understand what's happening?" Helen added gently. "Sweetheart, your mother has been beside herself with worry. We all have. This isn't like you." And there it was. The perfectly constructed trap. If I defended myself, I'd sound defensive, angry, unstable. If I explained about the money, I'd sound petty and mercenary. If I talked about Connor and Christmas, they'd reframe it as me overreacting to a minor incident. They'd position themselves as the concerned, reasonable family, and me as the irrational problem. I could feel the pressure of all their eyes on me, the weight of expectation that I would crumble, apologize, explain myself, beg for understanding. That's what I'd always done. That's what they were counting on. I took a slow breath and made a choice. Instead of defending myself, instead of falling into the trap they'd set, I asked a single question. "Victoria, when you made Connor stand outside in the snow on Christmas, were you taking a photo?" The room went completely silent, the kind of silence that feels alive, electric, with sudden tension. Victoria's carefully controlled expression flickered just for a fraction of a second, and I saw something underneath. Surprise. She hadn't expected this. That's not... She stopped, recalibrated. Connor was only outside for a few minutes and it was hardly snowing. He was watching the party through the window. It was a teaching moment about gratitude. That's not what I asked. My voice was steady, calm. "Were you taking a photo?" Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Marcus shifted in his seat. Patricia's hand moved to her throat in that gesture she always made when she was uncomfortable. "I was documenting a teaching moment." Victoria's voice had an edge now, the practiced empathy slipping slightly. "Like Mother did with us, like Grandma Eleanor did with Mother. It's how our family has always taught children to appreciate what they have." I turned to look directly at Reverend Matthews, holding his gaze. "Would you like to see the photo she took of my 8-year-old crying in the cold? Or should we discuss why documenting a child's suffering qualifies as a teaching moment?" The intervention fell apart after that. Reverend Matthews asked to see the photo, and when I pulled it up on my phone showing Connor's small figure pressed against the glass, his face barely visible but clearly distressed, the Reverend's expression changed completely. He looked at Victoria with something between confusion and disappointment, then stood and quietly excused himself, saying he didn't think his presence was helpful here. Helen followed shortly after, murmuring something about this being a family matter that needed to be worked out privately. The witnesses they'd brought to add moral authority to their ambush were abandoning ship. I left while Victoria was still trying to explain, still trying to reframe her voice rising in pitch as she insisted everyone was overreacting, that it was just a few minutes, that she was only doing what had been done to her. Patricia sat frozen on the sofa saying nothing, her silence somehow more damning than any words could have been. I drove home in a state of numb clarity, my hands steady on the wheel for the first time in weeks. I'd expected to feel triumphant or vindicated, but instead, I just felt tired. Tired and heartbroken for the child I'd been, for the child Connor was, for the cycle that seemed to perpetuate itself with such vicious efficiency. Connor was at the kitchen table when I walked in, the babysitter I'd hired for the afternoon gathering her things to leave. I paid her, thanked her, and locked the door behind her. Connor hadn't looked up from what he was doing. He had his art supplies spread across the table, the good-colored pencils I'd bought him for his birthday, several sheets of white paper arranged in a line. "Hey, buddy," I said softly, moving closer. "What are you working on?" He didn't answer immediately, his small hand moving carefully across the paper, adding detail to whatever he was creating. When I got close enough to see my breath caught in my throat, there were 4 drawings laid out in sequence like panels in a graphic novel. The first showed a small figure standing outside a large window, snowflakes falling around him, rendered in careful white pencil against the darker background. The perspective was from outside looking in, and through the window you could see shapes that were clearly people, though Connor had kept them vague, almost shadow-like. The second drawing showed the reverse perspective from inside looking out at the same scene. Here the people inside were drawn with more detail. Adults sitting around a table, smiling, eating their faces, expressing warmth and joy. The small figure outside was reduced to a distant shape, barely significant. The third drawing was the one that broke my heart. It was a close-up of the small figure's face, close enough to see details. Tears were drawn as small, frozen droplets on the cheeks, rendered with painful accuracy. But what destroyed me was the mouth carefully drawn into a smile. A forced, unnatural smile that didn't reach the eyes. It was the face of a child trying desperately to be good enough to be worthy of being let in. The fourth drawing showed something I hadn't expected. It was another perspective from inside, but this time the focus was on a phone held in an adult hand pointed toward the window where the small figure stood. The camera lens was drawn large, emphasized, making it the focal point of the entire image. "Connor," I whispered, kneeling beside his chair. "These are beautiful, baby. Can you tell me about them?" He kept coloring, adding shadows to the phone in the fourth drawing. His voice when he spoke was quiet, matter-of-fact in the way children can be when discussing things that hurt them. I smiled because I thought if I looked happy, she'd let me in faster. I thought maybe if I showed I was grateful and not crying, it would be enough. I had to close my eyes for a moment, fighting back tears. He'd learned the same terrible lesson I'd learned. That love was conditional. That comfort had to be earned through the right expression of suffering. A thought struck me then. Connor had an old tablet we shared, one he used for games and occasionally for taking photos. I'd set it up so that photos automatically synced to my cloud account, thinking it would be cute to see things from his perspective. I pulled out my phone and opened the cloud storage app, navigating to recently deleted files. There it was. A photo timestamp from Christmas night, 6:47 p.m. The thumbnail showed Connor outside a glass door. I opened it, my hands starting to shake as the full image loaded. The photo was taken from inside Victoria's house, looking out through the sliding glass door. Connor stood on the other side, his small hand pressed flat against the glass at about chest height. His face was turned slightly away, but you could see the tracks of tears on his cheek, illuminated by the porch light. Behind him, fat snowflakes fell through the darkness. But what made my stomach turn was the reflection visible in the glass. The door acted like a mirror in the darkness, and there, crystal clear, was Victoria's face. She was smiling, but it wasn't a warm smile, or even a cruel smile. It was something else entirely. Satisfaction, maybe, or vindication. the smile of someone who believed they were doing exactly the right thing, whose actions aligned perfectly with their values. I zoomed in on the image metadata. Photo taken at 6:47 p.m., deleted at 8:15 p.m. I'd picked Connor up at 7:30. Victoria had waited 45 minutes after we left to delete this photo. She'd looked at it, kept it for a while, and then deliberately erased it. The calculation of that made me feel sick. Connor had finished his coloring and was looking at me now, his dark eyes serious. "Mom, did Grandma Eleanor do this to you too?" The question caught me off guard. "What makes you ask that, honey?" "Because when I was outside, Grandma Patricia said something weird." He was choosing his words carefully, the way he did when he was trying to remember something exactly. "She said, 'Your mother went through the same thing, and she turned out fine. That means you had to stand outside too, right, when you were little like me.'" My mother hadn't just been permitting Victoria's cruelty. She'd been endorsing it. She'd been standing there watching her grandson cry in the cold and reinforcing the methodology, validating it as something with proven results. This wasn't abuse in their eyes. This was tradition. A rite of passage. A proven character-building technique passed down through generations like a family recipe. I thought about Eleanor's letter, about her regret, about how she'd taught Patricia the wrong lessons. And Patricia had learned them so well, had internalized them so completely, that she genuinely believed making children suffer in controlled doses would make them stronger. They weren't being cruel for cruelty's sake. In their minds, they were being good mothers, good grandmothers, following in the footsteps of Eleanor, who had survived the Depression, who had built strength through hardship. That somehow made it worse. If they'd known they were being cruel, if they'd done it with malice, there would be a chance of them stopping, of them changing. But they thought they were right. They thought they were helping. Connor picked up the fourth drawing, the one with the phone camera, and handed it to me. I made her smile really big because that's what scared me most. She looked proud. I kept Connor's drawings in a folder in my desk drawer, not quite sure what I was saving them for, but knowing they mattered somehow. Over the next 2 days, I found myself pulling them out repeatedly, studying Victoria's reflected smile in Connor's careful rendering, the forced grin on the crying child's face. Each time I looked at them, something solidified in me, hardened into a kind of resolution I'd never felt before. On Wednesday evening, 2 days after the failed intervention, my doorbell rang just as I was finishing dinner dishes. Connor was in his room doing homework, and I wasn't expecting anyone. When I looked through the peephole, I saw Daniel standing on my porch, a laptop bag slung over his shoulder, his expression troubled and determined in equal measure. I opened the door, surprised. "Daniel? Is everything okay? Can I come in?" He glanced over his shoulder as if checking to see if he'd been followed. "I need to show you something. It's important." I led him to the living room, offering coffee that he declined. He sat on the edge of my sofa, pulling his laptop from the bag with careful, almost reverent movements. At 33, Daniel had always been the family's neutral observer, the one who attended events but stayed on the periphery, who listened more than he spoke, who seemed to exist in the margins of family drama without really participating in it. He worked as an IT consultant, traveled frequently for work, and maintained a careful distance from Patricia and Victoria's intensity. "I need to show you something I've been working on for 3 years, he said, opening his laptop and angling it so I could see the screen. "It started as therapy, actually. My counselor suggested journaling about growing up in our family, processing some things I was carrying, but then I realized something." He paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Writing it down wasn't enough. I needed proof that I wasn't imagining it, that what I remembered actually happened the way I thought it did. The laptop screen showed a desktop organized with meticulous care. Folders labeled by year 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024. Each folder contained subfolders, emails, texts, audio, photos. My stomach clenched as I understood what I was looking at. "You've been documenting them. Documenting us. Documenting the family." Daniel opened the 2023 folder, then the email subfolder. I started noticing the pattern after I moved out 8 years ago. How they'd tell you one thing happened, then tell everyone else a different version. how stories would shift depending on who was listening. I thought I was going crazy, thought maybe I was remembering things wrong, so I started saving everything. He pulled up an email thread from March of last year. The subject line read, Easter planning. I recognized the sender as Victoria, the recipient as Patricia. I started reading and my hands went cold. We need to handle Sarah carefully this year, Victoria had written. She's been asking too many questions about Mom's finances. Maybe if we emphasize how much Mom has been struggling, how grateful she is for Sarah's help, it will reinforce that this is normal family support, not something Sarah should be tracking or tallying. Also, Helen mentioned Sarah seemed stressed at church. We should use that. If people are already seeing her as overwhelmed, it will be easier to explain any boundary setting as her not coping well. Patricia's response was brief but chilling. Agreed. I'll mention to the family that Sarah has been having a hard time. Plant the seeds. They were managing your reputation, Daniel said quietly. Shaping how other people saw you, so that if you ever pushed back, you'd already be framed as the unstable one. He opened another file, this one a text message thread he'd apparently been forwarded or somehow captured. I recognized Victoria's number. The messages were from 2 weeks before Christmas, coordinating with Marcus about what to tell people if Sarah asked about finances. If she brings up the loans we say they were gifts we thought she wanted to give, one message read. If she asks for repayment, we act hurt that she's putting a price on family. Frame it as her being money-focused. There were dozens of these, hundreds maybe. Years of coordination, of story alignment, of careful manipulation. Daniel opened an audio file next, and I heard Victoria's voice crystal clear from what sounded like a family gathering based on the background noise. We just need to keep her feeling like the unstable one until after her birthday, Victoria was saying. Then it won't matter. Once she signs the waiver, we can stop pretending. My birthday. The waiver. I looked at Daniel sharply. What waiver? He closed that file and opened a different folder. This one labeled Eleanor's Will, Research. Inside were screenshots of what looked like public property records, investment account listings, legal documents. This is the reason I'm showing you all of this now, Daniel said, his voice heavy. 3 months ago, I was at Mom's house fixing her computer. Victoria was on the phone in the next room and she didn't know I could hear her. She was talking to an estate attorney about Grandma Eleanor's will. My heart was pounding. I thought about the letter from Whitman and Associates, the cryptic notice about disclosure on my 36th birthday, Eleanor's handwritten note about being the primary beneficiary. Sarah, there's a substantial inheritance coming to you on your birthday. I didn't know the details until I started digging using some of my IT resources to pull public records and piece things together. He turned the laptop to face me more directly, showing a spreadsheet with careful notations. The house Grandma Eleanor owned is worth approximately $340,000 based on recent comparable sales. She had investment accounts with Vanguard and Fidelity totaling about $145,000. There's a life insurance policy that was never cashed out, another $50,000. Some other assets, bonds, smaller accounts. I couldn't breathe properly. The numbers on the screen seemed to blur and refocus. But there's a clause, Daniel continued. Something about maintaining family relationships. I don't know the exact legal wording, but I heard Victoria say that if you seem estranged from the family, if you've abandoned your relationships without cause, there's a way to contest the distribution. She said something about, once she signs the waiver, we can stop pretending. I think they've been trying to make you look unstable or like you're the one pulling away so that when the inheritance comes through, they can challenge it or pressure you to split it. I stared at the laptop screen, at the careful documentation of manipulation, at the financial records Daniel had compiled. Everything suddenly made horrible sense. The constant criticism designed to keep me insecure. The financial dependence they'd cultivated by taking my money while making sure I never felt valued for it. The way they'd framed me as too sensitive, too emotional, too unstable. They'd been building a narrative for years, and I'd been helping them write it by accepting their version of reality. How much? My voice came out as a whisper. How much total? Daniel pulled up a summary document, a final tally of everything he'd found. His voice was gentle as he answered. According to the property records and accounts, I found approximately $485,000. Plus Grandma's house, which would be yours to keep or sell. Nearly $500,000. More money than I'd ever imagined having. Enough to change Connor's future, to ensure his education, to give us security and freedom. And they'd been working for years to make sure I never saw it, or that if I did, I'd feel obligated to give it up to keep the peace, to maintain family harmony, to prove I wasn't the selfish person they'd spent decades convincing me I was. After Daniel left that night, I sat at my kitchen table for hours with his documentation pulled up on my own laptop, reading through years of coordinated manipulation until my eyes burned. I finally understood that this wasn't just about family dysfunction or personality conflicts. This was strategic, calculated financial, and I was going to need legal help to navigate what was coming. The next morning, I called Jennifer Wu, an estate attorney whose name I'd gotten from a colleague at work years ago, and filed away for someday. Someday had arrived. Jennifer could see me that afternoon, and I showed up at her downtown office with Daniel's flash drive full of documentation and a list of questions I'd been compiling since 3 a.m. Jennifer was in her mid-40s, sharp-eyed and direct in a way I found immediately comforting. She listened to my story without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad, her expression growing more focused as I described the Christmas incident with Connor, the intervention, Daniel's recordings, and finally the mysterious letter from Whitman and Associates about disclosure on my 36th birthday. "I need to see the actual will," she said when I finished. "The letter from Whitman suggests there's something unusual about the terms. I'm going to request a copy from probate court. Since the estate was settled 2 years ago, it should be public record. Give me a few days." 4 days later, I was back in her office. Jennifer had the will printed out, multiple pages of legal language that made my head swim, but she'd highlighted several sections in yellow. "Your grandmother was very deliberate about this," Jennifer said, turning the document so I could see. "The bulk of her estate goes to you as primary beneficiary. The house, the investment accounts, the life insurance proceeds, everything Daniel found and more. But there's a clause here that's unusual." She pointed to a highlighted section. "It's what's called a contestability provision. Essentially, your grandmother created a mechanism for the distribution to be challenged under specific circumstances." My mouth went dry. "What circumstances?" "If within 6 months after your mother's death, 2 or more of Eleanor's immediate family members file a joint claim alleging that you abandoned family relationships without justified cause, the court is required to review the distribution. If the court finds merit in their claim, the assets could be redistributed equally among all 3 siblings, rather than going primarily to you." After my mother's death. I focused on that detail. Not after my birthday. "The trigger is Patricia's death, not your birthday," Jennifer confirmed. "The birthday disclosure is separate, probably when you get access to accounts, or when the full terms are explained to you by Whitman. But the contestability clock starts when Patricia dies. And here's the critical part: justified cause." She pulled out a fresh legal pad and started writing as she talked. "Your grandmother essentially created a test, but she gave you an out. If you can prove that you had justified cause for limiting family contact, for setting boundaries, for appearing estranged, then the contest fails before it starts. The clause is actually written to protect you, not trap you, if you can demonstrate justification. What counts as justified cause?" My heart was pounding. Jennifer tapped her pen against the pad. "In estate disputes, justified cause typically means documented patterns of abuse. Physical abuse is the most clear-cut, but courts increasingly recognize emotional and psychological abuse, financial exploitation, harm to your children. The challenge is that your situation is more nuanced than a restraining order or criminal charges. We're talking about psychological manipulation, financial control disguised as family support, and emotional harm to Connor." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "We can build a case. Daniel's recordings help enormously. They show premeditation, coordination, strategic management of your reputation. But we need more. We need to document your attempts at setting reasonable boundaries and their rejection of those boundaries. We need to show your efforts at maintaining appropriate contact and their retaliation or escalation. We need Connor's therapist records if he's seeing someone's school counselor notes any documentation of the Christmas incident. The burden of proof is on them, right? I asked. They have to prove I abandoned the family without cause. Technically, yes. But here's what I learned practicing estate law for 20 years: judges hate family fights over money. They're looking for a reason to enforce the decedent's wishes and close the case. If we make your justification so crystal clear that there's no ambiguity, the court won't even seriously consider their claim. We want overwhelming documentation that you had every reason to protect yourself and Connor. I nodded, making mental notes. What do I need to do? First, we document everything from here forward, every interaction, every message, every attempt they make to contact you. You respond when appropriate, but you keep it brief and in writing when possible. You offer reasonable compromises. You suggest supervised visits or public meetings. When they reject those or respond with hostility, we have proof you tried. Second, we gather historical documentation, your financial records showing the money you gave them, any past emails or texts showing manipulation or coordination, therapy records, school records, medical records if Connor had any physical symptoms of stress. Third, we prepare for them to escalate. That word hung in the air. Escalate how? Jennifer pulled out another highlighted section of the will. This is where it gets complicated. Your mother was diagnosed with cancer when... I don't know exactly. Victoria told me a few weeks ago, but she'd apparently known for months. And the prognosis? 8 to 12 months, Victoria said. Jennifer did quick math on her notepad. Your birthday is in 11 months. If Patricia lives the full 12 months of her prognosis, she might pass away after your birthday. But if she declines faster, she could die before your birthday. Either way, the 6-month contestability period starts the moment she dies. That gives Victoria and Patricia a very narrow window to establish their narrative. The realization settled over me like ice water. They need to make me look estranged before Mom dies. Exactly. They have an incentive to escalate the conflict, to create incidents they can point to manufacture evidence of you being unreasonable or abandoning the family. And they need to do it while Patricia is still alive to serve as a witness and co-petitioner. That's probably why they orchestrated that intervention. They're building a paper trail. I thought about the folder Victoria had brought to the intervention, the printed documentation, the careful staging with witnesses. They were creating evidence, constructing a narrative they could present to a court. So I'm in a race, I said slowly, between Mom's death and my birthday, with them trying to make me look like the villain. While you're simultaneously trying to protect Connor from the pattern that hurt you and trying to maintain enough contact that you don't actually look estranged. Jennifer's expression was sympathetic. It's a difficult position. You need boundaries for your well-being and Connor's safety, but those boundaries are exactly what they'll use against you. She closed the will and folded her hands on top of it. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to really think about the answer. If your mother has less than a year to live, and if forcing some kind of reconciliation or maintaining more contact means sacrificing Connor's emotional well-being, exposing him to the same patterns that damaged you, which are you prepared to lose? The inheritance or your boundaries? The question hit me like a physical blow. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came. Because the truth was, I didn't know. Nearly $500,000 could change Connor's entire future. It could pay for college, provide security, give us options I'd never dreamed of. But at what cost? Could I let him be hurt, even in small ways, even in ways I could monitor and mitigate to secure his financial future? Could I participate in the system that had broken me in order to give him money? And underlying all of it was a darker question I barely wanted to acknowledge. What kind of person was I, if I chose money over protecting my child? I left Jennifer's office that day without answering her question. I couldn't. The choice she'd presented felt impossible, like being asked to choose between Connor's present and his future, between his emotional safety and his financial security. But driving home, something crystallized in my mind. Maybe I didn't have to choose. Maybe there was a third option: fight for both. Document everything so thoroughly that I could maintain the boundaries Connor needed while still proving justified cause for those boundaries. That night, I started the work Jennifer had outlined. I logged into my bank's website and began pulling records going back as far as the system would allow. 15 years of statements, transfers, loan documents. I created a spreadsheet with columns for date, amount, recipient, stated purpose, and whether I'd ever been repaid. The process took 3 full evenings, working late after Connor went to bed, cross-referencing paper statements I'd kept in storage for older transactions. The final tally made me feel physically sick. $127,000 in direct transfers to Patricia over 15 years. I'd labeled them as emergency car repair, unexpected medical bills, property tax assistance, temporary mortgage help. The word temporary appeared in my notes 17 times. None of it had been temporary. The payments had just been renamed, relabeled, but they'd never stopped. $43,000 in loan co-signatures for Victoria. Her car when she turned 30, which I was still making payments on because she'd defaulted after 18 months. The home equity line of credit for her kitchen renovation, where I'd ended up covering 6 months of payments during Marcus's business rough patch. A personal loan 3 years ago for what Victoria called temporary cash flow issues that had never been repaid. Then there were the smaller amounts that I'd almost forgotten, the ones that hadn't seemed significant individually, but added up to another $28,000. Family reunion deposits I'd covered. Contributions to cousins' weddings. My mother's 60th birthday party at the country club that had somehow become entirely my responsibility to fund. Christmas gifts for nieces and nephews that Victoria selected, and I paid for, always with the understanding that we'll settle up later, except we never did. I sent the spreadsheet to Jennifer and she called me the next morning. "This is excellent documentation," she said, and I could hear papers rustling on her end. "But I want you to look for something else. Go back through your old emails. Look at the responses you got when you provided this financial support. I'm looking for a pattern." I spent the weekend doing exactly that, searching my email archives for messages from Victoria and Patricia. What I found was even more damaging than the financial records. Every thank you message was performative and brief. When I'd co-signed Victoria's car loan, her email response was 3 sentences. "Thanks so much. You're a lifesaver. Talk soon." But 3 days later, a follow-up message. "BTW, Mom mentioned you missed her doctor's appointment last week. She was really hurt that you couldn't make time. I know your job is demanding, but family should come first." When I'd sent Patricia $5,000 for what she called emergency roof repairs, her thank you text said simply, "Received, thank you." The next message 2 days later, "Victoria said you seemed stressed at Easter. Are you taking care of yourself? You seemed short with the children." The pattern was consistent and devastating. Financial support was acknowledged minimally and quickly buried. But any perceived emotional failing, any moment I was less than perfectly available, was highlighted and criticized. When I attended family events, provided emotional labor, spent hours listening to Patricia complain about her neighbors or Victoria process her marriage frustrations, there was no acknowledgement at all. That was simply expected. But money-triggered brief gratitude followed almost immediately by criticism of something else entirely. The message was unmistakable. My value was purely transactional, and no amount of financial support would ever be enough to compensate for my fundamental inadequacy as a daughter and sister. I compiled these emails into a separate document, organizing them chronologically to show the pattern. Jennifer reviewed everything and invited me back to her office to discuss strategy. "This is powerful evidence," she said, spreading the documents across her conference table. "Not because it makes them look intentionally cruel, but because it shows a clear pattern of taking your support for granted while simultaneously maintaining your insecurity. Every major expense in their lives corresponded with increased criticism of you. Look at this." She pointed to a cluster of entries from 2019. You co-signed a $15,000 loan for Victoria in March. In April, you got 3 separate emails criticizing your parenting, your work-life balance, and your failure to visit Patricia enough. They needed you obligated and guilty, not confident and independent. So, how do we use this? I asked. Jennifer leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. We're not going to weaponize this publicly. We're not going to shame them or attack them. What we're doing is creating a counter-narrative. If they claim you abandoned the family, we show you were the primary financial supporter for 15 years. If they claim you're unstable or unreliable, we show you maintained a demanding career while providing this level of support. If they claim you're a bad mother, we document how your boundaries protect Connor from repeating the trauma you experienced. We're not attacking them. We're making it impossible for them to paint you as the villain without exposing themselves. She pulled out a fresh legal pad and started outlining our approach. Document every interaction going forward. Respond to reasonable requests with reasonable compromises. When they reject those compromises or escalate, we have evidence you tried. Maintain a paper trail showing you attempted appropriate contact and they demanded total submission instead. The goal isn't to prove they're terrible people, Jennifer said. The goal is to prove you had justified cause for protecting yourself and your son. That's a much lower bar, legally speaking, and you've already cleared it with what you've shown me. I was gathering up the documents to leave when Jennifer mentioned one more thing. I requested copies of all loan applications you co-signed just to have the complete paper trail. One came through this morning that I think you should see. She slid a document across the table. It was a loan application from 12 years ago, Victoria's car loan. Standard form, nothing unusual until I got to the section where she'd been asked to list references and describe their relationship to her. Under my name, Victoria had written, Sister, Financial Analyst, Financially stable and emotionally dependent on family approval. She'll co-sign. I read it 3 times, my hands starting to shake. Emotionally dependent on family approval. She'd written that on an official document, reduced my entire psychology to a single sentence designed to reassure a loan officer that I could be counted on, that I wouldn't back out, that my need for family acceptance would override any financial caution. And she'd been right. 12 years ago, I had co-signed without hesitation, without reading the terms carefully, because saying no would have meant conflict and disapproval. She'd understood me perfectly, understood exactly what lever to pull to get what she needed. That document won't be admissible in probate court, Jennifer said quietly. But it tells you something important about how they viewed you all along. Not as a person with agency and boundaries, but as a resource to be managed through emotional manipulation. I stared at Victoria's handwriting on that form, at the casual confidence with which she'd summarized my deepest vulnerability and packaged it for a stranger's consumption. She'd known. They'd all known. And they'd used it systematically for years. I couldn't stop thinking about that loan application, about Victoria's cold assessment of my psychology reduced to a single exploitable sentence. I kept the document in my purse for days, pulling it out to reread when I needed to remember that their manipulation wasn't in my imagination. But the anger it sparked was complicated by something else, something I didn't want to acknowledge, a growing sense that I needed to understand Victoria better, not to excuse her behavior, but to protect Connor from whatever drove her. Daniel appeared at my door again the following Tuesday evening, and I could tell immediately something was wrong. He looked haggard, like he hadn't slept well, and he was carrying a manila folder that he held against his chest like a shield. "I need to show you something," he said without preamble. "I've been debating whether to tell you for weeks now. It feels like invasion of privacy, like I'm betraying Victoria in some way. But given what she's doing to Connor, I think you have a right to understand." I led him inside my stomach, already nodding with apprehension. We sat at the kitchen table, and Daniel placed the folder between us without opening it immediately. "There's something about Victoria you need to know, something the family doesn't talk about." He took a breath. "Victoria had a son from her first marriage, a boy named Lucas. He's 14 now." I stared at him, genuinely shocked. What I knew, Victoria was married before Marcus, but I never knew there was a child. Most people don't. The family kept it very quiet after things fell apart. Daniel's fingers tapped nervously on the folder. Sarah, she doesn't have custody, hasn't had it for 8 years. She barely sees him at all. The implications of that hit me immediately. 8 years ago. That's when Connor was born. Exactly. Daniel finally opened the folder, revealing what looked like legal documents. I found these through public records. Court documents are accessible if you know where to look, and I've been trying to piece together what happened. Victoria's ex-husband, James, filed for emergency custody when Lucas was 6. The grounds were concerning enough that the court granted it pending full evaluation. He slid the first document toward me. It was a petition for emergency custody modification, and the language made my hands go cold as I read. Petitioner requests emergency custody based on ongoing concerns about emotional abuse of the minor child, specifically including but not limited to excessive criticism that undermines the child's self-worth. Punishment through isolation and withdrawal of affection, manipulation of the child's perception of reality and self, and creation of conditions where the child feels chronically inadequate regardless of achievement or behavior. The words could have been describing my own childhood. They could have been describing what Victoria had done to Connor at Christmas. The court appointed a child psychologist to evaluate the situation. Daniel continued, pulling out another document. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, here's her report. I read through the clinical language, the careful professional phrasing that nonetheless painted a devastating picture. The child presents with concerning patterns consistent with psychological maltreatment. Lucas demonstrates hypervigilance around his mother's emotional state, excessive apologizing for minor or non-existent transgressions, and persistent anxiety about meeting unstated expectations. When asked about his relationship with his mother, Lucas stated, "I'm never good enough no matter what I do. She says she loves me, but it doesn't feel like love." This evaluator recommends supervised visitation pending family therapy and documented behavioral changes from the mother. My throat was tight. I'd felt exactly that way as a child. I'm never good enough. It doesn't feel like love. Victoria was granted only supervised visitation, Daniel said quietly. 2 hours per week at a family services center with a monitor present. She attended for about 6 months. Then the visits became sporadic. When Lucas turned 12, he requested through his attorney that visits stop entirely. The court granted his request. He's 14 now, and as far as I know, they haven't seen each other in over 2 years. He pulled out one more document, this one more recent. It was a motion Victoria had filed attempting to reinstate visitation denied by the court. Attached was a statement from Lucas's attorney that made my heart break. The child experiences severe anxiety attacks at the mere suggestion of resuming contact with his mother. He reports feeling like nothing he does is ever good enough for her, and that visits left him feeling worthless and confused. Lucas has made significant progress in therapy since contact ceased. Forcing resumption would be detrimental to his well-being. The child, now of sufficient age and maturity to express a reasoned preference, wishes no contact with his mother. I had to set the document down, my vision blurring with tears. For Lucas, for the child Victoria had been, for myself, for Connor. "Do you see the timeline?" Daniel asked gently. "Victoria lost custody of Lucas in 2016, the same year you had Connor. Instead of taking that as a wake-up call, instead of getting therapy or acknowledging that maybe the parenting methods she'd learned from Mom and Grandma Eleanor were harmful, she doubled down. She convinced herself that the court was wrong, that James had manipulated the system, that the problem wasn't how she parented, but that she hadn't been consistent enough or strict enough. I could see it now, the terrible logic of it. Victoria had lost her first child because of the very methods her mother had used on her methods that came from Eleanor. That loss should have broken the cycle. It should have made her question everything. Instead, it had made her more defensive, more committed to proving those methods worked. Every interaction with Connor became a test, I said, slowly, understanding dawning. She wasn't trying to hurt him specifically. She was trying to prove to herself that she wasn't the problem with Lucas. That if she just did it right, if she was just firm enough and consistent enough, she could raise a child who would turn out strong, and that would vindicate everything. Exactly. Daniel's voice was heavy with sadness. Connor became a referendum on her first failure. If she could succeed with him using the same methods, it would mean Lucas's rejection of her wasn't about her parenting, wasn't about the damage she'd caused. It would mean the court was wrong, James was wrong, Lucas was wrong. She wasn't trying to hurt Connor. She was trying to save herself from having to confront what she did to her own son. And the realization was crushing. Victoria wasn't just a villain in this story. She was a victim too, caught in the same cycle that had damaged me, damaged our mother, damaged Eleanor before her. She was perpetuating abuse not out of cruelty, but out of desperate self-protection because acknowledging the harm would mean facing an unbearable truth about what she'd done to Lucas. But that understanding didn't change what she'd done to Connor. It didn't change the choice I had to make to protect him. Sympathy for her pain couldn't override my responsibility to prevent her from creating another damaged child, another Lucas, another me. Daniel pulled out one final document, and when I saw what it was, my breath caught. It was a printout of a message, apparently from Victoria's failed attempt to contact Lucas through social media 2 years ago, before he'd blocked her entirely. The message read, "Lucas, I know you don't want to hear from me, but I need you to understand something. I only ever wanted to make you strong. The world is harsh and unforgiving, and children who are coddled don't survive it. When you have children someday, you'll understand. You'll see that love sometimes means being tough, means letting them struggle, means teaching them that comfort has to be earned. I love you. I always have. I just loved you enough to prepare you for reality instead of spoiling you with false security." I stared at those words, at the complete absence of self-awareness, at the inability to see that she'd lost her child, not despite her parenting philosophy, but because of it. She'd loved him in her broken way, and that love had driven him away permanently. The revelations about Victoria and Lucas haunted me for days. I kept thinking about that final message she'd sent him, the complete inability to see that her tough love had destroyed her relationship with her own child. It made me both more sympathetic to Victoria's damage and more determined to protect Connor from becoming another casualty of this generational curse. Then a week after Daniel's visit, I received an unexpected phone call at work. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a professional female voice asked if this was Sarah Mitchell. "This is Dr. Kavita Patel, your mother's oncologist. I'm calling to schedule a family meeting regarding Patricia Mitchell's care plan. Are you available to come in this week?" The words felt wrong somehow. "I'm sorry, did you say oncologist? My mother has cancer." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that told me I'd said something unexpected. "Yes, Ms. Mitchell. Your mother was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer 4 months ago. I was under the impression the family had been informed. Is that not the case?" 4 months. My mother had been diagnosed 4 months ago and no one had told me. I scheduled the appointment for the next day, my hands shaking as I wrote down the time and location. The oncology center was in a medical building downtown, all soft lighting and calming earth tones, designed to make the unbearable slightly more bearable. Dr. Patel was a slight woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and the careful manner of someone who delivered bad news for a living. She pulled up my mother's scans on a large monitor, pointing to areas of bright white that she explained were tumors. "Your mother has stage 4 adenocarcinoma already metastasized to her liver and bones," Dr. Patel said gently. She was presented with several treatment options, including aggressive chemotherapy that might extend her life by several months to a year. She declined. She's opted for palliative care, only focusing on comfort and quality of life rather than prolonging it. "How long?" My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and hollow. "Based on current progression, we're estimating 6 to 10 months, possibly less if the decline accelerates." Dr. Patel studied my face carefully. "Ms. Mitchell, I was told you were aware of your mother's diagnosis. Your questions suggest otherwise. Who informed the family?" "Apparently just my sister Victoria." The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. When was my mother diagnosed? 4 months ago in early September. September. Victoria had known since September, had kept this information from me for 4 months while simultaneously criticizing me for being distant from our mother. Had used Mom's illness as leverage in their intervention attempt without ever actually telling me how serious it was. That evening I drove to my mother's house unannounced. Patricia answered the door looking smaller than I remembered, more fragile. The cancer was visible now in the hollows of her cheeks, the papery quality of her skin. "Sarah." She seemed surprised, but not displeased. "I wasn't expecting you." "I just came from Dr. Patel's office." I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "She wanted to schedule a family care meeting. Apparently she was surprised I didn't know about your diagnosis." Patricia's expression barely flickered. She moved slowly to her armchair, lowering herself with visible effort. "Victoria thought it best not to overwhelm you. You've been so distant lately, so caught up in your own issues. She was trying to protect you from additional stress." The gaslighting was so smooth, so automatic that I almost didn't catch it. "Protect me or control the information so you could use it strategically." "Don't be dramatic, Sarah." Patricia's voice had that familiar edge of irritation. "I'm dying. Does it really matter who told you when?" I sat down across from her, forcing myself to stay calm. "Mom, Dr. Patel says you have 6 to 10 months. Is that accurate? Give or take. The doctors can never be precise about these things." She adjusted the blanket across her lap with hands that trembled slightly. "Your grandmother prepared me for hardship by being tough, by teaching me not to expect comfort or coddling. I prepared you and Victoria the same way. It's how our family survives difficult things." "And how's that working out?" I couldn't keep the bitterness from my voice. "Victoria lost custody of her son because of those methods. I've spent my entire adult life in therapy trying to undo the damage." Patricia's face hardened. "Victoria's situation with Lucas was complicated. James poisoned that boy against her, and you've always been too sensitive seeing trauma where there was simply discipline and structure." She paused, and her next words came softer, more calculated. "I don't have much time left, Sarah. Do you really want to spend it fighting over ancient history? I'd like my children together, my grandson close by for whatever time I have. Is that too much to ask of a dying mother?" The emotional blackmail was sophisticated and expertly delivered. She was framing my boundaries, my protection of Connor, as cruelty toward a dying woman, making my need for safety seem petty and vindictive against the backdrop of her limited time. I left without answering, without making promises I wasn't sure I could keep. Over the next 2 days, I consulted with both Jennifer and Dr. Morrison, the therapist I'd started seeing 3 weeks ago, who specialized in family systems and generational trauma. Their advice was remarkably similar. "You can grieve for her from a safe distance," Jennifer said during our phone call. "Deathbed reconciliation is a choice, not an obligation, especially when the dying person hasn't actually changed or apologized when they're using their death as leverage for one final manipulation." Dr. Morrison was more gentle but equally firm. "Your mother has 6 to 10 months of life remaining. Connor has potentially 60 to 70 years ahead of him. You need to ask yourself, who are you protecting, and from what? Exposing Connor to harm because your mother is dying doesn't undo the harm, it just ensures the pattern continues into another generation." But knowing the right answer intellectually didn't make it easier emotionally. What if I was wrong? What if I was being cruel and unforgiving, denying a dying woman peace with her family? What if the regret of refusing reconciliation would haunt me long after she was gone? I was still wrestling with these questions when my phone buzzed with a new voicemail. I'd missed a call from Patricia while in a meeting. Her voice on the recording was weak, but determined. "Sarah, I've asked Victoria to bring Connor to visit me next Tuesday after school. I'd like you to come too, of course. But I won't stop her from bringing my grandson if you refuse. He should have the chance to say goodbye to his grandmother while I'm still lucid enough to enjoy his company. I hope you'll make the right choice." The message was clear, Bring Connor yourself on my terms, or Victoria will bring him on hers. Either way, they were determined to maintain access to my son, and they were using my mother's impending death as the ultimate leverage. I didn't respond to my mother's voicemail. I spent the weekend trying to figure out how to navigate this impossible situation, consulting with Jennifer about legal options for supervised visits, talking with Dr. Morrison about how to explain boundaries to Connor in age-appropriate terms. By Monday morning, I'd drafted a formal letter to Patricia and Victoria, outlining the conditions under which I'd bring Connor to visit 1-hour visits at Patricia's house with me, present the entire time, no photography without my permission, no discussions about family conflicts or my parenting in front of Connor. I was at my desk Tuesday afternoon about to send that letter when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Connor's elementary school. My heart jumped immediately to the worst possibilities. Injury, illness, accident. Ms. Mitchell, this is Mrs. Reynolds, the school counselor. Her voice was professional but cautious. I wanted to give you a heads up about something that happened during lunch today. Connor's aunt came by to surprise visit him. My entire body went cold. What? A woman identifying herself as Victoria Morrison, Connor's aunt, came to the office around 12:30, requesting to see Connor. She said it was a family matter and she wanted to take him to lunch off campus. Our policy requires parent permission for any non-custodial family visits, so we asked her to wait while we called you. When we couldn't reach you immediately, she became quite upset. I was already standing, grabbing my keys, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. What do you mean, upset? She claimed there was a family emergency involving Connor's grandmother and that you were aware but being unresponsive. She implied that we were preventing her from fulfilling her duties as a concerned family member during a crisis. Mrs. Reynolds paused. Ms. Mitchell, I'm looking at our records, and I see that you specifically removed Victoria Morrison from Connor's approved contact list last week. You sent us written notice, so we did not allow the visit and Ms. Morrison left after about 20 minutes of discussion. I'd removed Victoria from Connor's approved pickup list 8 days ago, along with formal written notice to the school that under no circumstances was she to have unsupervised access to my son. I'd copied Jennifer on that letter, creating a paper trail of reasonable protective measures. Did Connor know she was there? My voice sounded strange, tight with fury I was struggling to contain. No, we kept this entirely at the administrative level. Connor had no idea. Mrs. Reynolds' voice gentled. Ms. Mitchell, is everything all right? The family emergency Ms. Morrison mentioned. There is no family emergency. Thank you for following protocol and for calling me. I'll be sending you a follow-up letter confirming that the restrictions on Victoria Morrison remain in full effect. I hung up and stood in my office for a full minute, trying to breathe through the rage. Victoria hadn't gone to that school out of love for Connor. She hadn't gone because of any emergency. She'd gone to create an incident to establish a pattern she could point to, later concerned aunt trying to maintain relationship with nephew, blocked by increasingly paranoid and unstable mother. She was building her case, creating documentation for the inheritance challenge she'd already threatened. I didn't think. I just moved. I left work early, drove straight to Victoria's house in the affluent subdivision where she lived with Marcus and their 2 teenagers. Her SUV was in the driveway. I parked behind it, blocking her in, and rang the doorbell. Victoria answered wearing yoga clothes and an expression of carefully crafted surprise. Sarah! What a nice surprise. I was just about to call you, actually. Mom's having a really hard day and she asked specifically to see Connor. I thought maybe we could coordinate. You went to Connor's school today. My voice was flat, cold. Without my permission, without calling me first. You tried to take my son off campus. Victoria's expression shifted slightly, a micro-adjustment in her performance. I was trying to bring him to see his grandmother who is dying and asking for him. The school overreacted to what was clearly a family matter. I removed you from his approved contact list last week. I sent formal written notice to the school. You knew that, Victoria. You knew exactly what you were doing. I was trying to maintain a relationship with my nephew while you're having some kind of breakdown." Her voice rose, the careful control starting to crack. "You've cut off the family financially. You're refusing to let Connor see his dying grandmother. You're making everything about your supposed trauma from 30 years ago. Connor needs stability, and if you can't provide it, finish that sentence." I stepped closer, my voice dropping to something dangerous. "Say what you're really thinking." Victoria's composure shattered. All the practiced empathy the concerned sister act fell away like a mask. What was underneath was raw and furious and desperate. "Fine. You want honesty? Here it is. If you keep alienating Mom before she dies, if you keep making yourself look unstable and vindictive, cutting off your family without legitimate cause, yes, I will petition for the court to reconsider the inheritance distribution. I'll argue that someone who abandons their dying mother, who isolates her child from his family, who cuts off financial support without warning, isn't the person Grandma Eleanor would have wanted as primary beneficiary. The will has provisions for exactly this kind of situation." She was breathing hard now, her face flushed. "And if your parenting continues to be this erratic, if you continue to make decisions based on your own unresolved issues, rather than Connor's best interests, I will explore custody options. Grandparents' rights, third-party custody, whatever legal avenues exist. Connor deserves better than a mother who weaponizes him against his family because she can't deal with her own psychological problems." The threat was now explicit, laid bare. Not just the inheritance challenge, but custody of Connor. She was willing to try to take my son away from me using the same system that had taken Lucas away from her, apparently without seeing any irony in that at all. I felt something settle in me, then a cold clarity that burned away the last remnants of family obligation and guilt. When I spoke, my voice was steady and absolutely certain. "Go ahead and try, Victoria. Please do. Because when this ends up in court, we're going to discuss why you lost custody of Lucas. Every detail. The court findings about emotional abuse. The child psychologist's report about psychological maltreatment. Lucas's statement about never feeling good enough. His anxiety attacks at the thought of seeing you. All of it." Victoria's face went white. "You have no right. It's public record. Daniel already pulled it. And Lucas is 14 now, old enough to consent to unsealing those files if he chooses. He's already reached out to me, Victoria. Did you know that he contacted me to thank me for protecting Connor the way no one protected him?" I leaned in slightly. "So, yes, please take me to court. Let's have a judge compare your parenting of Lucas with my parenting of Connor. Let's discuss which of us has a documented history of causing psychological harm to children. I'm very much looking forward to that conversation." I drove away from Victoria's house with my heart pounding, but my hands steady on the wheel. The confrontation had been necessary, but as my adrenaline faded, I realized I couldn't keep operating this way. Reactive confrontations gave them ammunition. They could paint me as aggressive, unstable, emotionally volatile. I needed to be smarter. I went straight home and did what Jennifer had been training me to do. I documented everything. I wrote a detailed account of the school incident while it was fresh in my mind, including exact times Mrs. Reynolds' specific words, Victoria's claims about a family emergency that didn't exist. I requested a formal written report from the school and asked them to note the incident in Connor's permanent file. Then I drafted a certified letter to Victoria keeping the language formal and unemotional. As of this date, you are prohibited from any contact with Connor Mitchell except through me as his parent. Any attempts to contact him at school extracurricular activities or other venues without my explicit prior written permission will be considered a violation of his safety and my parental authority. This letter serves as formal notice of these restrictions. I sent copies to the school, to Connor's soccer coach, to the director of his after-school program. I was creating a paper trail documenting reasonable protective measures taken by a concerned parent. When I called Jennifer to update her on the confrontation and the school incident, I expected her to be concerned about Victoria's explicit threats. Instead, she sounded almost pleased. "This is perfect," Jennifer said, and I could hear her typing notes. She explicitly threatened both custody action and inheritance contestation in the same conversation. She admitted her motivation is about the inheritance. She's building our case for us, Sarah. Every move she makes now creates evidence of exactly what we need to prove that their concern isn't about family relationships, it's about control and money. So what do I do now? I was exhausted, overwhelmed by the constant strategic thinking this required. Now we go quiet, Jennifer said. We let her keep making mistakes. Your silence and your boundaries are more powerful than any argument. When you don't engage with their provocations, when you don't defend yourself or explain or try to convince them, it forces them to act. And every action they take creates evidence. Victoria going to Connor's school was a gift. Your mother using her terminal diagnosis as leverage is a gift. Document everything, but stop confronting them directly. Over the next week, I implemented what Jennifer called quiet boundary enforcement. I updated my will, naming Daniel as Connor's guardian if anything happened to me, with specific instructions that Victoria and Patricia were not to have unsupervised access. I created a password-protected journal where I documented every concerning incident I could remember from the past year, with dates and details and supporting evidence where it existed. I didn't block Victoria's or Patricia's numbers. Jennifer had been clear about that. Complete cutoff could be painted as abandonment, as me being the one who destroyed family relationships. Instead, I responded to their messages, but only in writing, and only with brief formal replies. When Patricia called, I let it go to voicemail and sent a text response. I saw your call. Is there something specific you need? When Patricia texted asking me to reconsider bringing Connor to visit, I responded with carefully worded boundaries. I'm happy to maintain appropriate contact. I'm not comfortable with Connor's unsupervised exposure to situations that violate the boundaries I've established for his well-being. I'm willing to discuss supervised visits with specific parameters. Her response came back within minutes. Supervised visits. I'm his grandmother, not a stranger. This is exactly the kind of paranoid behavior Victoria was talking about. I didn't take the bait. I didn't defend myself or explain or try to make her understand. I just replied, I understand you disagree with my decision. My priority is Connor's emotional safety. Jennifer had explained the strategy in detail during our last meeting. We're maintaining what courts call reasonable but protective contact. You respond to messages within 24 hours, so they can't claim you're unresponsive. You keep responses brief and formal so they can't twist your words. When they suggest visits or contact, you offer specific alternatives that meet your boundaries. I practiced this over and over. When Victoria texted suggesting Connor come for a sleepover with his cousins, I replied, Connor and I would be happy to meet you and the cousins at the park this Saturday for an hour. Please let me know if that works. When Patricia asked me to bring Connor to Sunday dinner, I responded, I can bring Connor for a 1-hour visit on Sunday afternoon. I'll need to stay present. Please let me know if 2-3 p.m. works for you. Every time they refused these reasonable compromises, every time they insisted on their terms or accused me of being controlling, it went into the documentation file. I wasn't cutting them off. I was offering reasonable alternatives. They were the ones rejecting compromise. The waiting was harder than the confrontation had been. I wanted to defend myself, to explain, to make them understand. But Jennifer kept reminding me, every unreasonable demand they make, every threat, every manipulation, every refusal of reasonable compromise, we document it all. They're digging their own grave, Sarah. You just have to let them. On Thursday evening, my phone buzzed with a group text. Patricia had sent it to me, Victoria, and Daniel. The message was brief and loaded with implications. Family meeting this Sunday at my house, 2 p.m., mandatory. We need to clear the air before I'm too sick to have these conversations. If Sarah doesn't come, she's making her choice clear to everyone. I stared at the message, recognizing the manipulation immediately. Mandatory erased any pretense of this being an invitation. Before I'm too sick, weaponized her terminal diagnosis. Making her choice clear implied that not attending would be proof of abandonment, of choosing conflict over reconciliation with a dying mother. Daniel's response came through first. "I'll be there." I sat with my phone for 20 minutes crafting and deleting various responses. Finally, I sent, "I'm willing to meet with you individually, Mom, to discuss your care needs and our relationship. I'm not comfortable with group meetings that have historically been used to pressure and criticize me. I hope you understand." The response from Patricia was immediate. "So, you're refusing. That tells me everything I need to know about your priorities." I didn't reply. I forwarded the entire text thread to Jennifer with a note. "Is this the kind of documentation you meant?" Her response came back within an hour. "Exactly this. Save everything. And Sarah, don't go to that meeting. It's a trap." I called Jennifer back that night and told her I'd changed my mind. I was going to the meeting. "Sarah, I strongly advise against this," she said immediately. "It's designed to pressure you into backing down. They've assembled witnesses, prepared their narrative. You'll be outnumbered and ambushed." "I know," I said quietly. "But if I don't go, they'll use it as proof that I'm the one refusing reconciliation. Patricia will tell everyone I chose to stay away from my dying mother. I'd rather face them on my terms than let them control that narrative." I paused. "And I'm bringing Daniel. And documentation. If this is going to be a tribunal, I'm going to present my case." Sunday afternoon arrived cold and gray, the kind of February weather that matched my mood perfectly. Daniel picked me up at 1:30, his car loaded with the laptop containing his evidence files. I had a leather portfolio containing printed financial records, email chains, and the formal letters I'd sent to the school and to Victoria. "You sure about this?" Daniel asked as we pulled up to Patricia's house. "No. But I'm doing it anyway." The driveway was packed with cars. I recognized Patricia's sedan, Victoria and Marcus's SUV, my Aunt Linda's hybrid, Uncle Robert's truck. There were at least 3 other vehicles I didn't immediately identify. My stomach tightened. This wasn't a family meeting. This was exactly what Jennifer had warned me about. Patricia answered the door herself, moving slowly, her face drawn with illness and something else. Determination, maybe, or vindication. "Sarah, Daniel, thank you for coming. Everyone's in the living room." The scene that greeted us confirmed my worst suspicions. The furniture had been rearranged exactly like it had been for the intervention 3 weeks ago. Patricia sat in her armchair, positioned centrally like a judge on a bench. Victoria and Marcus occupied the sofa. Aunt Linda and Uncle Robert sat in dining chairs that had been brought in. 2 cousins I rarely saw stood near the fireplace, and seated in the same chair he'd occupied at the intervention was Reverend Matthews, his expression already uncomfortable, like he was regretting his presence. There were at least 12 people in that room, and I knew with certainty that every one of them had heard Victoria's version of events. I was walking into a carefully staged tribunal. Patricia spoke first, her voice weak but carrying across the room. "I don't know how much time I have left. The doctors say months, but who can really know? What I do know is that I won't have my children divided when I die. I won't leave this world with my family torn apart." She looked directly at me. "That's why I asked everyone here today, to bear witness, to help us find a path to reconciliation." The word reconciliation implied I was the one who'd broken things, the one who needed to make amends. The witnesses weren't here neutrally. They were here to pressure me into compliance. Victoria stood, and I realized with a sinking feeling that she'd prepared remarks. She held index cards, for God's sake. Her voice was measured and sorrowful as she began. "I want to start by saying that I love my sister. We all do. Which is why we're so concerned about the changes we've seen in her behavior over the past few months." She glanced at her cards. "Sarah has cut off Mom financially, without warning or explanation, leaving her struggling to pay basic bills. She's refused dozens of phone calls from family members who care about her. She's prevented Connor from seeing his dying grandmother by refusing all visit requests. She's made paranoid accusations about family members trying to hurt her son. And most recently, she's taken legal action to prevent me from even speaking to my nephew." Victoria's voice caught perfectly on the word nephew, a little hitch that suggested genuine emotion. "We're not here to attack Sarah. We're here because we're worried about her mental state and about Connor's well-being. A child shouldn't be isolated from his family because his mother is struggling." The performance was polished and devastating. I could see it landing exactly as Victoria intended. Aunt Linda was nodding. Uncle Robert looked troubled. Even Reverend Matthews seemed persuaded. Daniel started to speak, but I touched his arm gently. "Wait," I whispered. I needed to let Victoria finish, to let her build her entire narrative before I dismantled it. When Victoria sat down, Patricia looked at me expectantly. "Sarah, do you have anything to say?" I stood slowly opening my portfolio. My hands were steady. "Yes, I'd like to address these concerns with specific facts." I pulled out the financial summary I'd prepared, 15 years of data condensed into a 2-page document with clear categories and totals. First, regarding financial support. I have bank records documenting $198,000 in direct support to this family over 15 years. I'm happy to share copies with anyone who'd like to verify the numbers. I began distributing the printed summaries. Aunt Linda took one, her eyes widening as she scanned the figures. Uncle Robert studied his copy carefully. Even Reverend Matthews accepted one, though he looked uncomfortable doing so. Second, regarding Connor's access to family. I haven't refused all visits. I've offered repeated supervised visits at neutral locations. I have emails documenting these offers and their rejection because they weren't on your terms. I pulled out the email chain showing my suggestions for park visits, 1-hour supervised meetings, all declined. Third, regarding my mental stability and these paranoid accusations about Connor being hurt. I paused, making sure everyone was listening. Would anyone like to explain why Victoria went to Connor's elementary school last Tuesday and attempted to remove him from campus without my permission after I had formally revoked her access to him in writing? The room went completely silent. The kind of silence where you can hear people breathing. Patricia's face drained of what little color it had. "What Victoria? What is she talking about?" Victoria stood abruptly. "That's a complete distortion of what happened. I went to bring Connor to see you because you were asking for him. The school overreacted." "The school followed protocol," I said calmly. "Protocol I established in writing after Victoria made my 8-year-old son stand outside in the snow at Christmas while she photographed him crying." Aunt Linda set down her copy of the financial summary. "Victoria, you told me Sarah just stopped helping the family one day, out of nowhere. You said she cut everyone off for no reason." She gestured at the document. "This shows nearly $200,000 over 15 years. That's not out of nowhere." Victoria's composure was cracking. "Those numbers are exaggerated. She's manipulating." Daniel stood up. His voice was quiet, but it cut through Victoria's protests. "They're not exaggerated. I verified every transaction, and I have recordings of you and Mom discussing how to manage Sarah's expectations about Grandma Eleanor's inheritance." "Would everyone like to hear those?" Patricia's hand went to her throat. "You recorded us, Daniel. You recorded private conversations. I documented a pattern of manipulation that's been happening for years," Daniel said steadily. "Sarah wasn't imagining it. It was real. It was coordinated, and it was strategic." The unified front was breaking. I could see it happening in real time. Uncle Robert was looking at Victoria with something like betrayal. Aunt Linda had picked up the financial summary again, studying it more carefully. Even Reverend Matthews had shifted in his seat, his expression troubled. Patricia's voice shook when she finally spoke, and for the first time she sounded genuinely uncertain. "What inheritance, Sarah, you think this is about Eleanor's money? Is that what this family has become to you?" The family meeting disintegrated after that. Patricia was too shaken to continue. The witnesses were uncomfortable, and Victoria stormed out with Marcus trailing behind her. Daniel and I left quietly, and I spent the drive home in a kind of numb exhaustion. I'd presented my case, revealed the truth, but I had no idea if it would matter in the end. My 36th birthday arrived on a Tuesday in late February, exactly 11 months after that Christmas, when I'd found Connor shivering outside Victoria's window. I took the day off work and drove downtown to the offices of Whitman and Associates, the law firm that had sent me that cryptic letter so many months ago. George Whitman was a distinguished man in his late 60s with silver hair and the careful demeanor of someone who'd spent decades managing family conflicts over money. His office was lined with law books and framed degrees, and he gestured for me to sit in one of the leather chairs across from his massive desk. "Ms. Mitchell, happy birthday," he said, pulling a thick file from his drawer. "As per your grandmother's instructions, I'm authorized to disclose the full terms of her will and the provisions that specifically pertain to you on this date." He opened the file and began reading in that formal way attorneys have translating legal language into something approaching normal English. The numbers were even larger than Daniel had estimated. The house Eleanor had owned in the historic district was now valued at $340,000 based on recent comparable sales. Her investment accounts with Vanguard and Fidelity totaled $145,000. There was a life insurance policy worth $50,000, municipal bonds worth another $35,000, and various smaller assets that brought the total to approximately $485,000. "You are named as primary beneficiary for all of the above," Whitman said, sliding a document across the desk for me to review. "Your siblings Daniel and Victoria are named as secondary beneficiaries to receive small amounts. Daniel receives $20,000. Victoria receives $10,000. The bulk of the estate goes to you." My hands trembled as I held the paper. This was real. This was actually happening. "There's also a letter." Whitman continued, pulling out a sealed envelope with my name written in Eleanor's distinctive handwriting. "Your grandmother requested that I read this aloud to you on your birthday in my presence, so there could be no question about its authenticity or content." He opened the envelope carefully and began to read. "To my granddaughter, Sarah. I am giving you this inheritance not as a reward for being good, not as payment for enduring what you endured, but as an apology. An inadequate one, but the only one I can offer now." My throat tightened. Whitman's voice remained professional, but Eleanor's words hit me like physical blows. "I taught your mother a cruel philosophy. I believed that love must be earned through suffering, that comfort makes people weak, that children need to be broken down before they can be built up properly. I learned this from my own mother during the Depression, and I never questioned it. I should have. I was wrong, Sarah. So profoundly, devastatingly wrong." The letter continued, Eleanor's words stark and unflinching. "Patricia learned too well. She internalized every harsh lesson and magnified it. Victoria has inherited that same sickness, that same inability to love without control. But you somehow remained kind, despite us. You remained soft in the ways that matter. You broke the pattern without even knowing you were doing it, and I only hope I'm giving you this freedom before it's too late to matter." Whitman paused, glancing at me with something like sympathy before continuing. "Use this money to build something better. Use it to protect your son from what we did to you. Use it to break what I started. This is not a gift, Sarah. It's restitution. And it's permission to walk away from anyone who asks you to sacrifice your child's well-being to maintain their comfort. I'm sorry I didn't give you this permission while I was alive." The letter was signed and dated 1 month before Eleanor's death. Whitman set it down gently and gave me a moment to compose myself before continuing. "Your grandmother was aware that this bequest might create significant conflict within the family," he said, pulling out another document. "She included a contestability provision specifically to address that possibility. The relevant clause states that if within 6 months of Patricia Mitchell's death, 2 or more immediate family members file a joint petition claiming you have abandoned family relationships without justified cause, the court may review the distribution and potentially redistribute assets equally among all 3 siblings." My stomach clenched. So Victoria had been right about that much. "However," Whitman continued, and his emphasis on that word made me look up sharply, "justified cause is very broadly defined in this document. It includes, and I quote, protecting the well-being of minor children from harmful family patterns, maintaining reasonable boundaries for psychological health, and refusing to perpetuate cycles of emotional harm. Eleanor specifically noted in her instructions to me that this caveat was designed to protect you, not trap you. She wanted you free to set whatever boundaries you needed without financial penalty, but she phrased the clause in neutral language for legal defensibility. I stared at the document, trying to process what this meant. Eleanor had anticipated everything. She'd known that giving me this money might make me a target. She'd known that Victoria and Patricia might use my boundaries against me. So she'd built in protection disguised as neutral legal language, but actually weighted in my favor. "There's one more thing," Whitman said. "Eleanor left instructions that if any family member contests this, they forfeit their own inheritance entirely. Victoria's $10,000 would be donated to charity if she files a petition against you." The strategic brilliance of it took my breath away. Eleanor had made it financially costly for Victoria to challenge me while simultaneously giving me legal cover to maintain boundaries. I was still processing this when there was a knock on Whitman's office door. His secretary opened it apologetically. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are 2 people in the lobby who say they're Ms. Mitchell's family and they need to speak with her immediately. A Patricia Mitchell and a Victoria Morrison." My heart sank. Of course they'd figured out when the will would be read. Of course they'd shown up. "Should I tell them you're not available?" the secretary asked. Before I could answer, Whitman stood. "Actually, given the circumstances, it might be beneficial to have this conversation here in a neutral location with a witness present. Ms. Mitchell, are you willing to see them?" I thought about it for a long moment, then nodded. Better to face this now with a lawyer present than to have it ambush me later. Patricia and Victoria were escorted into Whitman's office. Patricia looked worse than she had at the family meeting, her illness more visible in the harsh fluorescent lighting. Victoria's expression was controlled, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes. Victoria spoke first, her voice carefully modulated. "So, Grandma Eleanor created a test. She wanted to see if we could stay together as a family despite money being involved. And you're failing it, Sarah. You're choosing money over family." But Patricia interrupted, and her voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Uncertain, wavering. She was looking at Eleanor's letter which lay on Whitman's desk. "No, she said she was wrong, about the way she raised me." Patricia's hand reached toward the letter, then pulled back. "She said the philosophy was cruel." Victoria's composure cracked slightly. "Mom, don't let her manipulate you with a guilty conscience letter. Grandma was elderly and bitter at the end. She wasn't thinking clearly." But Patricia wasn't listening. She was staring at me now, and I saw something I'd never seen before in my mother's eyes. Doubt. Real, genuine doubt about everything she'd believed and taught. "Victoria," Patricia's voice shook. "Did you know about this inheritance when you asked me to do the Christmas teaching moment with Connor?" Victoria's face went carefully blank the way it did when she was buying time to construct an answer. "Mom, I don't think this is the appropriate place to—" "Did you know?" Patricia's voice was stronger now, cutting through Victoria's deflection. "Did you know about Eleanor's will when you came to me in November and suggested we do the teaching moment with Connor at Christmas?" The silence stretched. George Whitman sat very still behind his desk, a professional witness to this family fracture. "I may have heard something," Victoria finally said, her tone deliberately vague. "Grandma mentioned to me years ago that she'd left something to Sarah. I didn't know the amounts or the details." "Show me your phone." Patricia's hand was trembling, but her voice was firm. "What, Mom? This is ridiculous. Show me your phone. Right now, or I swear to God, Victoria, I will believe every word Sarah has said about you." Victoria's jaw tightened. She pulled her phone from her purse, unlocked it with visible reluctance, and handed it to Patricia. I watched my mother's face as she began scrolling her fingers, moving slowly, deliberately, through what I assumed were text messages. Patricia's face went from pale to ashen. She scrolled in silence for what felt like an eternity, and I could see the exact moment something landed. Her hand went to her mouth. "What is this?" Patricia turned the phone so Victoria could see the screen. "This text thread with Marcus from last August, 8 months ago." Victoria reached for the phone, but Patricia pulled it back. "Don't. I'm reading this out loud." Her voice shook as she began. "Victoria to Marcus, August 14th. Met with the estate attorney today. Confirmed that Grandma's will leaves the bulk to Sarah, but there's a contestability clause. If we can show she's abandoned family relationships without cause, it gets redistributed equally. That would give us about $160K. My stomach dropped. 8 months ago. This had been planned since last summer. Patricia continued reading, her voice getting quieter. Marcus responds, "How do we prove abandonment?" Victoria writes back, "We don't have to prove it yet. We just have to create the appearance that she's pulling away. Stop accepting her compromises. Make everything difficult. Once Sarah gets cut out of the will or forced to split it, we'll have enough for the down payment on the lake house." Patricia looked up from the phone. Then Marcus writes, "What about your mom? She won't go along with making Sarah look bad." And you wrote... Her voice broke. "Mom agrees the inheritance should be split equally since Sarah has been distant lately. She doesn't know about the contestability clause specifics. But she'll back me up that Sarah has been withdrawing from family." The betrayal on Patricia's face was absolute. "You told me Sarah was pulling away naturally, that she was becoming cold and distant and we needed to bring her back. You said we should do teaching moments like Grandma did to remind her what family means." Victoria stood abruptly. "Mom, you're taking this out of context. What context makes this acceptable?" Patricia's hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. "You told me I didn't have much time left. You said I should make sure my grandchildren knew what strength looked like before I died. You suggested the Christmas window exercise specifically. You said it worked on Sarah when she was young and it would work on Connor." The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. Victoria had used everything. Patricia's terminal diagnosis, her belief in Eleanor's harsh parenting philosophy, her genuine desire to pass something meaningful to her grandchildren before she died. All of it had been weaponized in service of a financial scheme. Patricia looked at me, and I saw something I'd never seen before on my mother's face. Horror mixed with recognition. I thought I was continuing what my mother started, the family tradition. I thought I was being a good grandmother teaching Connor resilience the way I'd learned it. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize you were using me to manipulate the inheritance. That's not what I was doing." Victoria's composure was finally shattering, her voice rising with defensiveness and something that might have been panic. "You're making it sound calculated and cruel when it wasn't like that at all." "Then what was it like?" I asked quietly. It was the first time I'd spoken since my mother and sister had entered the office. Victoria whirled to face me, and the mask she'd worn for months finally cracked completely. "You want to judge me? Fine. Yes, I knew about the inheritance. Yes, I thought it should be split fairly among all three of us, not just handed to you because Grandma felt guilty in her final days." She was old Sarah. Old and probably not thinking clearly. The fair thing, the right thing would be to split it equally. "The will was written 5 years before she died," George Whitman interjected calmly. "Mrs. Mitchell was of sound mind and under no duress. I have the medical evaluations to prove it." Victoria ignored him, focused entirely on me now. "And yes, I thought if you were going to get all that money, you should at least prove you're committed to this family first. You should have to demonstrate that you're not going to take Grandma's money and run cutting us all off. Is that so wrong? To want some assurance that nearly $500,000 isn't going to someone who's going to abandon her dying mother." The entitlement in her voice was breathtaking. She genuinely believed this. She thought Sarah should have to earn an inheritance that Eleanor had freely chosen to give, that maintaining family relationships was a fair price to extract for money that wasn't Victoria's to control. "You manipulated Mom," I said, keeping my voice steady, though my heart was pounding. You used her illness and her beliefs about parenting to create situations that would make me look bad. You coached her on what to say and when to say it. You engineered the Christmas incident with Connor specifically to create evidence. I didn't engineer anything, Victoria shot back. I suggested a teaching moment that our family has used for generations. If you overreacted to it, if you made it into some traumatic event, that's on you, not me. Patricia made a small sound, almost like a whimper. She was still holding Victoria's phone, staring at the text thread with Marcus. When she spoke, her voice was hollow. You told me Sarah was becoming unstable, that she was pulling away for no reason, and we needed to document it for her own good. You said we might need to consider Connor's safety if her mental state declined. Patricia looked up at Victoria, and I saw something break in my mother's face. You used my cancer to manipulate Connor, and you used Connor to manipulate the inheritance. She paused, and the question she asked next was quiet but devastating. What were you planning to use the inheritance to manipulate? Victoria didn't answer Patricia's question. She grabbed her phone from my mother's hands, muttered something about this being a waste of time, and left George Whitman's office with Marcus hurrying after her. Patricia remained seated, staring at her hands like they belonged to someone else. Eventually, Whitman gently suggested she might want to go home and rest, that this was a lot to process. She left without looking at me. I drove home in a fog, signed the necessary paperwork that Whitman had prepared, and somehow made it through the evening routine with Connor. Dinner, homework, help, bath time, bedtime story. I moved through it all on autopilot, my mind replaying the scene in Whitman's office over and over. It wasn't until Connor was asleep and I was alone in my bathroom getting ready for bed that it hit me. The panic attack came out of nowhere, a sudden crushing pressure in my chest that made me think I was having a heart attack. My hands went numb. My vision tunneled. I couldn't breathe properly, each gasp shallow and unsatisfying. I sank down onto the bathroom floor back against the tub, trying to remember the breathing techniques Dr. Morrison had taught me. 4 counts in hold for 7, 8 counts out. But my body wouldn't cooperate. The hyperventilation was making me dizzy, and I had to put my head between my knees. That's when the memory surfaced. Not gradually, not gently, but all at once, like a wave crashing over me. I'd been pregnant before Connor, 10 years ago, not 8. I was 26, newly divorced, terrified, but also cautiously hopeful about becoming a mother. I'd made it to 12 weeks before I started bleeding. The miscarriage happened at home, painful and frightening, and I'd gone to the emergency room alone because I didn't want to burden anyone. How had I forgotten? How had I buried this so completely? But even as I asked the question, I knew the answer. I'd buried it because remembering hurt too much. Because the family's response had been so devastating that forgetting felt like survival. The memories came faster now, unstoppable. The weeks leading up to the miscarriage, Patricia calling multiple times a day with concerns. Are you sure you're ready for this? You're barely managing your own life. A baby is such a huge responsibility. Victoria dropping by my apartment uninvited, making helpful comments about how young mothers often struggled, how important it was to have family support, since I clearly wasn't mature enough to handle this alone. The stress had been constant, relentless. My doctor had assured me that stress didn't cause miscarriages, that these things just happened, sometimes that I shouldn't blame myself. But I'd never fully believed her. I'd always wondered if the anxiety had somehow contributed, if my body had responded to the constant messaging that I wasn't ready, wasn't capable, wasn't enough. And then, the aftermath. The phone call to tell my mother what had happened, expecting comfort, and receiving something else entirely. Victoria's voice on the phone when I'd told her, "Oh, honey, maybe this is for the best, though. I mean, you weren't really in a stable place to be a mother yet. You're still figuring out your own life after the divorce. Maybe this is the universe telling you to wait until you're really ready." Patricia's response had been similar, wrapped in the language of faith and fate. Everything happens for a reason, Sarah. God knows when we're truly prepared for motherhood. When you're in a better place emotionally and financially, it will happen. this just wasn't the right time. They'd taken my grief and alchemized it into a referendum on my adequacy as a future mother. They'd transformed my loss into evidence of my failure, my not readiness, my fundamental insufficiency. Even my body's betrayal had become proof that I wasn't good enough. I'd started doubting myself then, started believing that maybe they were right, that I wasn't ready, that I'd somehow caused this through my own inadequacy. By the time I got pregnant with Connor 3 years later, I was already primed for self-doubt. Every parenting decision felt like a test I was failing. Every crying fit, every missed milestone, every moment of normal childhood difficulty became evidence that I didn't know what I was doing. No wonder I'd been so susceptible to their criticism. They'd been conditioning me to doubt my maternal instincts years before Connor was even born. I was still sitting on the bathroom floor, my breathing finally starting to normalize, when another memory surfaced. A card. Victoria had sent me a card after the miscarriage. I'd kept it in a memory box with other cards and letters from that period of my life, unable to throw it away, but also unable to look at it. I got up on shaky legs and went to my closet, pulling down the box from the top shelf. It took me several minutes of digging through old photos and ticket stubs before I found it. A sympathy card with generic flowers on the front. My hands trembled as I opened it and read Victoria's handwriting. Dear Sarah, I'm so sorry for your loss. I know this must be difficult, but try to see it as a blessing in disguise. You have so much growing to do before you're ready for the responsibility of motherhood. When you have a baby, you're ready for when you're really prepared and stable. Let us know. We'd love to help you learn to be a good mother. Until then, take this time to work on yourself. Love, Victoria. I read it 3 times, each word landing like a physical blow. When you have a baby you're ready for. When you're really prepared. We'd love to help you learn to be a good mother. The implication was clear: I wasn't a good mother yet. I needed their help to become one. And that help would come with conditions, with judgment, with constant assessment of whether I was measuring up. I'd received this card 10 years ago and had somehow convinced myself it was kind, that Victoria was trying to be supportive in her own way. But reading it now with the clarity of everything I'd learned over the past months, I saw it for what it really was. A preemptive strike. A way to ensure that when I did eventually have a child, I'd already be convinced I needed their guidance, their approval, their constant supervision to do it right. They'd started grooming me to be a compliant, grateful, doubting mother before I'd even had my first living child. I spent 2 days after finding Victoria's card in a kind of emotional paralysis, going through the motions of daily life while internally processing everything I'd uncovered. The miscarriage, the conditioning, the years of systematic undermining that started long before Connor was born. I called in sick to work, arranged for Connor to have playdates after school, and gave myself permission to simply feel the weight of it all. Daniel showed up at my door on Thursday evening unannounced, but not unexpected. I'd texted him after the will reading to thank him for backing me up at Whitman's office, and he'd responded that he needed to talk to me about something important, something he'd been working on. He came in carrying his laptop bag and what looked like a heavy manuscript printed on standard copy paper bound with black clips. His expression was serious, almost apologetic. "I need to show you something," he said, sitting at my kitchen table and placing the manuscript between us. "I should have told you about this months ago, but I kept putting it off because I wasn't sure how you'd react." The manuscript was thick, easily 300 pages. The title page read, "The Inheritance of Silence: Growing Up in a Family That Ate Its Own," by Daniel Mitchell. "You wrote a book about us." My voice came out flat, not quite angry, but not pleased either. "I've been writing it for 2 years, Daniel said quickly. "It started as therapy. My counselor suggested journaling about growing up in our family, processing the dynamics I'd witnessed and been part of. But as I wrote, I realized it was becoming something bigger than just personal processing." He pushed the manuscript toward me. "I showed early chapters to my support group for adult children of dysfunctional families. 3 different people told me it helped them understand their own situations in ways they hadn't been able to articulate before. One woman said it made her realize she wasn't crazy, that the gaslighting she'd experienced had a name and a pattern. "So you want to publish it?" It wasn't quite a question. "I want to publish it with changed names and identifying details, yes. But Sarah, I won't do it without your explicit permission. You're the hero of this story, the person who actually broke free. It's your right to decide if our family's dysfunction gets turned into public testimony." I pulled the manuscript toward me and started reading. Daniel had included a table of contents with chapter titles that made my stomach clench: The Scapegoat's Education, Financial Control as Love Language, The Christmas Window, How Traditions Become Torture. I flipped to the chapter about my miscarriage and felt my breath catch. Daniel had documented it with devastating clarity, including details I'd forgotten I'd told him. The phone calls from Patricia and Victoria in the weeks before, their constant undermining disguised as concern. Victoria's card that I'd just rediscovered. The way they'd transformed my grief into evidence of my inadequacy. "How did you remember all this?" I asked, my voice thick. "I saved your texts from that time. You reached out to me when it happened, when you couldn't talk to them. I kept everything because even then something felt wrong about how they were treating you." Daniel's voice was gentle. "I documented the financial manipulation too. The way they'd praise Victoria for taking care of Mom while you were the one actually sending money. How they'd tag team you at family events, one criticizing while the other played supportive, keeping you off balance." I kept reading, disturbed by how clearly Daniel had seen things I'd completely missed while living through them. He'd noticed patterns I'd been too close to recognize, documented a systematic dismantling of my confidence that had been happening for decades. But alongside my recognition and validation, I felt something else. Discomfort. Violation, almost. "If you publish this, Victoria and Mom will know it's about them. Even with changed names and details, they'll recognize the story." I set the manuscript down. "You're essentially ending any possibility of family reconciliation." Daniel met my eyes steadily. "There is no reconciliation coming, Sarah. Even if you wanted it, they're incapable of the kind of vulnerability and accountability that real reconciliation would require. Victoria can't admit she was wrong about Lucas, about you, about anything. Mom can't face that she perpetuated what Eleanor started. They're too invested in their own narratives." "Then what's the point of the book?" I asked. "Revenge exposure." "Warning," Daniel said simply. "This book isn't revenge. It's a warning sign for people who are still trapped in similar systems. People who think they're the problem, who've been gaslit so thoroughly they can't see the pattern. If even one person reads this and recognizes their own family gets out before it damages their kids, then it's worth it." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the weight of the decision. Our family trauma packaged and sold. But also our family trauma transformed into something that might help others. "I have conditions," I finally said. Daniel nodded immediately. "Whatever you need. Change enough details that it's not obviously us. Different city, different professions, different specifics. Don't mention Connor by name or age, just reference the child. Leave out the exact inheritance amounts, just say it was substantial. And any proceeds above your actual expenses, publication costs. Everything goes to a charity supporting adult children of dysfunctional families. This isn't our story to profit from. It's our testimony to offer." "Done," Daniel said without hesitation. "All of it. I was planning most of that anyway." He paused, then added, "There's one more thing. I want to include a final chapter about what happens when someone actually breaks free. Not the dramatic explosion, but the slow, deliberate boundary setting. The way you protected Connor while maintaining enough contact that they couldn't claim total abandonment. The strategic documentation. I'd like to interview you for that part when everything's settled. Show people that escape doesn't have to be scorched earth." I thought about the possibility that my painful navigation of these past months might help someone else. "Okay, when it's over, when the 6-month contestability period has passed, or Patricia has, when it's truly over, we can do that interview." Daniel started gathering up the manuscript relief visible on his face. Then I asked the question I'd been dreading. "What are you calling the chapter about Victoria?" Daniel's expression grew uncomfortable. He flipped through the table of contents and pointed to Chapter 8. "The golden child's tarnish when the favorite can't maintain the facade." The Sunday after my conversation with Daniel about the book, I took Connor to church, as I always did. It was something I'd continued doing throughout everything, partly because Connor enjoyed Sunday school, and partly because I refused to let Victoria drive me out of spaces I'd been part of for years. But something was different that morning. Subtle but unmistakable. Karen Mitchell, a woman who'd been in Victoria's Bible study group for years, stopped me in the hallway between Sunday school and the main service. "Sarah, I've been meaning to tell you I think you're doing a wonderful job with Connor. He seems so happy and well-adjusted. That's a testament to your parenting." It was a simple compliment, the kind mothers exchange all the time, but I recognized the subtext. Karen had always been in Victoria's orbit, one of the women who nodded sympathetically when Victoria mentioned her difficult relationship with her sister. Now, she was deliberately choosing to speak to me to offer praise that implicitly contradicted whatever narrative Victoria had been spinning. In the sanctuary, I noticed other small shifts. Women who used to gravitate toward Victoria's pew now found seats near mine. Conversations that would have stopped when I approached now continued welcoming me in. It was like watching a social ecosystem quietly rebalance itself. After the service, Reverend Matthews approached me as I was helping Connor with his coat. He looked uncomfortable, troubled even. "Sarah, could I speak with you for a moment privately?" I sent Connor to play with some other kids in the fellowship hall and followed Reverend Matthews to his office. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "Several, actually. When Victoria invited me to that family meeting at your mother's house, and then again to the one before, that she framed it as deep concern for a sister in crisis. She painted a picture of someone spiraling, making erratic decisions, isolating herself and her child. I should have asked more questions. I should have spoken to you directly before agreeing to participate." I nodded, not quite trusting myself to speak. "I've since heard some things that trouble me deeply," he continued. "Things about how that Christmas incident with Connor actually happened. Things about financial manipulation that's been going on for years. I don't know all the details, and frankly, it's not my place to know. But I wanted you to know that I see now I was used to add pressure to a situation I didn't fully understand." "Thank you," I said quietly. "That means a lot." He didn't elaborate on what he'd heard or who had told him, but I could guess. The truth was spreading through the quiet network of church relationships and community gossip. People were talking, comparing notes, reevaluating who they'd believed. Through Daniel, I heard more detailed reports of how things were shifting in Victoria's life. We met for coffee one afternoon while Connor was at soccer practice, and Daniel looked troubled as he updated me. "Marcus moved into the guest room 2 weeks ago," he said, stirring his coffee absently. "Emily posted something on social media that's causing waves. Something about how sometimes the people who look perfect are perfect at hiding who they really are. Everyone in her grade knows she was talking about Victoria." I felt a complicated mixture of emotions hearing this. Satisfaction that the truth was emerging, but also sadness for Victoria's children who were bearing the consequences of their mother's choices. "Jason refuses to go to Sunday dinners at Mom's anymore," Daniel continued. "He's 16, old enough to put his foot down. He told Marcus he's tired of walking on eggshells, tired of never being good enough. Marcus apparently didn't fight him on it. The facade Victoria had worked so hard to maintain was cracking in visible public ways, and I hadn't done anything to make it happen. I'd simply stopped participating in the system that kept her image intact. The shift was even visible at Connor's school. At the last PTA meeting, another mother named Jennifer had sat next to me during the presentation on the upcoming spring fair. Afterward, as we were gathering our things, she'd said almost casually, "I always thought Victoria had it so together, you know. Perfect house, perfect kids, perfect life. But Emily told my daughter some things recently that made me wonder what really goes on behind those closed doors." She'd said it sympathetically, with none of the cruel glee that sometimes accompanies fallen pedestals. Just honest reassessment, the kind that happens when someone's carefully constructed image no longer matches observable reality. I realized, sitting in my therapist's office the following week, that I'd stumbled into something powerful without even trying. "You're not destroying Victoria," Dr. Morrison said when I described what was happening. "You're just no longer propping up the illusion. For years, you played your assigned role, the struggling one, the difficult one, the one who needed guidance. That role made Victoria look good by contrast. When you stopped playing it, when you started showing up healthy and calm with a thriving child, the contrast reversed." She leaned forward slightly. "The best revenge isn't destruction, Sarah. It's becoming so healthy that people can't help but notice the difference between your peace and their chaos. You're living proof that leaving toxic systems doesn't lead to collapse, it leads to flourishing." I thought about Connor, who'd blossomed over these past months. His anxiety had decreased noticeably. He laughed more freely. His art had evolved from those dark, precise drawings of suffering to colorful, joyful scenes of adventure and imagination. His teacher had commented on how much more confident he seemed in class. People noticed. They noticed Connor's joy contrasted with the visible strain in Victoria's children. They noticed my calm contrasted with Victoria's increasingly brittle control. I didn't have to explain or defend or attack. I just had to keep living well, and the truth became self-evident. That Friday evening, I was making dinner when my phone buzzed with a Facebook message notification. The name made my hands still Lucas Morrison. I opened the message, my heart pounding. "Hi, Sarah. I hope it's okay that I'm reaching out. My dad told me some of what's been happening with you and my mom and the family. I heard you stood up to her, that you protected your son from the things she used to do to me. I just wanted to say thank you. For a really long time, I thought I was the only one who couldn't be enough for her. It helps to know it wasn't just me, that I wasn't the problem. Thank you for showing me that." I responded to Lucas that evening, thanking him for reaching out and telling him that he'd been on my mind, that I hoped he was doing well. We exchanged a few more messages over the following weeks, nothing deep, just occasional check-ins. It felt important to maintain that connection, to let him know that someone in his family saw him clearly and believed him. 3 months after the will reading in mid-May, I received a call from Evergreen Hospice. The nurse's voice was gentle but direct. Patricia's condition had deteriorated rapidly over the past week. She was transitioning into active dying, likely had days left, maybe a week at most. Was I planning to visit? I called Jennifer Wu first, letting her know. Her advice was immediate and predictable. "Sarah, you don't have to go. Legally, your absence won't hurt your case. In fact, given the timing, it might be safer to maintain distance. If Patricia says something that Victoria can twist, if there's any kind of confrontation—" "I need to go," I interrupted gently. "Not for her, for me. I need to know I gave her the chance to say whatever she needs to say." "Then go alone," Jennifer advised. "Don't bring Connor. Document the visit in your journal afterward. If Patricia says anything significant about the inheritance, or Victoria, write it down with as much detail as you can remember." I drove to the hospice facility that afternoon, a serene building designed to look more like a home than a medical facility, with gardens visible through large windows and soft music playing in the hallways. The nurse led me to Patricia's room, warned me that she was lucid but very weak, and left me at the doorway. My mother looked impossibly small in the hospital bed. The cancer had taken so much of her over these months, weight, color, vitality. An oxygen tube ran beneath her nose, and her hands resting on top of the blankets were almost skeletal. But when she turned her head at the sound of the door, her eyes were clear. "Sarah." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't think you'd come." I pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. "I'm not here to reconcile," I said honestly. "I'm not here to pretend the past didn't happen or that everything's fine between us. But you're dying, and I needed to know I gave you the chance to say whatever you really want to say." Patricia studied my face for a long moment, and I saw something there I'd rarely seen from her: uncertainty. Vulnerability, even. I won't ask for forgiveness, she said slowly, each word clearly costing effort. Because I don't think I understand yet what I did that needs forgiving. Not really. Not completely. She paused to catch her breath. My mother taught me that hardship builds character, that struggle makes you strong. I believed it because I survived. I looked at my own childhood and thought, I made it through and I'm fine. And you survived too, Sarah. You're successful and capable. She stopped, her breathing labored. I waited, letting her gather her thoughts. But I'm watching Victoria now, and I'm starting to see. Her voice cracked slightly. She didn't survive. Not really. She's recreating it all, doing to others what was done to her, trying to prove it works. And Connor? Patricia's eyes filled with tears. I keep seeing his little face in that window at Christmas, and it's your face when you were 7, and it's my face from even earlier. When does it end, Sarah? This thing that gets passed down, when does it stop? It wasn't quite an apology. She hadn't said, I'm sorry for what I did to you. She hadn't acknowledged specific harms or taken direct responsibility. But it was acknowledgement, recognition. A glimpse of understanding that maybe, just maybe, the philosophy she'd lived by was wrong. I realized this was as close to accountability as Patricia was capable of giving. She was dying, confronting the legacy she was leaving, and she could see just enough to know something had been terribly broken. But she couldn't quite name it directly, couldn't quite say, I hurt you and it was wrong. I took her hand, careful of the IV line. Her skin was papery and cold. It ends with me, Mom. I'm breaking it. I'm not strong because of what you did to me. I'm strong despite it. I survived, but I shouldn't have had to. And Connor will be strong because of what I won't do to him. Because I'm teaching him that love doesn't have to be earned through suffering. That comfort isn't weakness. That he's enough exactly as he is. Patricia's tears spilled over, running down into the hollow of her temples. I wanted you all to be tough enough to survive anything. To be prepared for how hard the world is. Her voice was barely audible now. But I forgot to teach you it was okay to want more than survival. I forgot that thriving is different from just not dying. It was the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. Not a complete reckoning, not a full accounting of damage done, but a genuine moment of truth. I felt something release in my chest, some tight knot I'd been carrying for decades. Not forgiveness exactly, but something like peace with the impossibility of ever getting what I'd needed from her. We sat in silence for a while. I told her about Connor's recent soccer game, about a project he'd done at school. She listened with her eyes closed, occasionally squeezing my hand. I talked about neutral things, safe things, giving her the gift of normalcy in her final days without pretending we had a relationship we'd never actually had. When her breathing deepened into sleep, I stood to leave. I was gathering my purse when her eyes opened again, just barely. Sarah. Her voice was so faint I had to lean in close to hear. The will. Eleanor's claws. Don't give it up. She struggled for breath. She was trying to save you from what she made me. Don't let Victoria manipulate you into splitting it. Eleanor wanted you to be free. Let yourself be free. I knotted my throat too tight to speak. Patricia's eyes closed again, and this time she didn't open them. I stood there for another moment, looking at this woman who'd shaped so much of my pain and who was now slipping away, and I felt an overwhelming sadness. Not for what we were losing, but for what we'd never had. For all the years we could have had something different, something better, if she'd been able to break free of what Eleanor taught her. I left the hospice as the sun was setting, the sky streaked with pink and orange. I sat in my car for several minutes before driving home, letting myself feel everything, the grief, the relief, the complicated tangle of love and anger and pity and freedom that came with watching a parent die. Patricia passed away 3 days later, quietly in the early morning hours. Daniel called to tell me. Victoria apparently had been there at the end. Patricia's funeral was held on a gray Saturday morning at the same church where I'd been watching the social dynamics shift over the past months. The service was well attended, packed with people from her book club, her volunteer organizations, neighbors, and distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. I sat in the third row with Daniel on one side and Connor on the other. Victoria and her family occupied the front row along with Aunt Linda and Uncle Robert. The physical separation felt symbolic of visible representation of the fracture that had been growing for months and was now complete. Reverend Matthews gave a kind eulogy focusing on Patricia's volunteer work and her dedication to family. Victoria had been asked to speak, and she delivered a polished tribute to a mother who taught us the value of strength, resilience, and family loyalty. Her voice broke in precisely the right places. Several people dabbed at their eyes. The reception was held in the fellowship hall afterward, the usual gathering of casseroles and coffee and people sharing memories. I stayed for Connor's sake, letting him spend time with the few cousins he actually got along with, but I kept to the periphery observing. That's when I heard Victoria's performance begin. She was surrounded by a small group of relatives I recognized, but didn't know well, speaking in that particular tone of restrained grief, mixed with gentle disappointment. "It was so hard being Mom's primary caregiver these last months," she was saying. "I was there every day managing her medications, coordinating with hospice, making sure she wasn't alone. Sarah managed to visit once." She paused, letting that sink in. Once in all those final months. I know everyone handles grief differently, but I'd hoped Mom would have more family support at the end. It was technically true. I had visited once during Patricia's hospice stay. What Victoria didn't mention was that I'd been blocked from visiting before, that my offers of help had been refused, that the primary caregiver narrative erased months of Victoria controlling access and information. I watched her work the room, saw how people's expressions shifted as they absorbed this version of events. Sarah, the neglectful daughter. Victoria, the devoted one, who'd borne the burden alone. She was building her narrative in real time, creating witnesses who would remember her version when questions were asked later. Daniel noticed too. He moved close to me and whispered, "She's laying groundwork. Should we say something?" "No," I said quietly. "Let her dig deeper. Every exaggeration, every half-truth, every convenient omission goes into evidence if this ends up in court. The more she commits to this story, the harder it'll be for her to walk it back when we produce documentation showing what actually happened." The funeral ended, and I took Connor home. That evening, Jennifer Wu called to check in on me and to deliver a reminder I'd been dreading. "The 6-month contestability period officially started today," she said. "Victoria has until 6 months from Patricia's death to file a joint petition with at least one other family member claiming you abandoned your mother without justified cause. Based on what you've described from the funeral, I'd say she's already preparing her case." She was telling everyone I only visited once in Mom's final months, I confirmed. "Perfect. Document that. Write down exactly what she said and who was present to hear it. Because here's what's going to happen. Victoria will file within the next month, probably with Aunt Linda or another relative who's heard her version and doesn't know the full context. She'll include sworn statements about your supposed abandonment. And when we counter, we'll have your documented offers of help that were refused, your attempts at reasonable contact, the emails showing Victoria controlling access. Her funeral narrative will fall apart under examination. What do I need to do right now?" We finalize our defensive documentation. Everything we've been building, the financial records, the emails about refused visits, the school incident report, Daniel's recordings, Connor's therapist notes if you've started that. We're building the counter case before she even files, so when the petition hits, we're ready to respond immediately. The waiting was excruciating. I went to work, took care of Connor, tried to maintain some semblance of normal life while knowing legal action was coming. 3 weeks after the funeral, on a Thursday afternoon, a process server appeared at my office. The petition was thick, professionally prepared, bound in legal blue covers. I signed for it with shaking hands and immediately scanned the first few pages before calling Jennifer. "Victoria Mitchell Morrison and Linda Patricia Hernandez co-petitioners," I read aloud. Petition for review of estate distribution under contestability clause. Estate of Eleanor Mitchell deceased. The legal language was dense, but the core argument was clear. Victoria and Aunt Linda claimed I had demonstrated a pattern of abandoning family relationships without justified cause, particularly during Patricia Mitchell's final illness, thereby violating the spirit and intent of Eleanor Mitchell's bequest. The petition included sworn statements. Victoria's was 3 pages long, detailing my sudden and unexplained financial withdrawal from family support, my refusal to allow my minor son reasonable contact with his grandmother and extended family, my limited presence during Patricia's hospice care despite multiple invitations and requests, and my pattern of making unfounded accusations against family members who expressed concern for my well-being. Aunt Linda's statement was shorter, but no less damaging. She swore that I'd been increasingly distant from Patricia over the final year of her life, that I'd refused multiple family gatherings and reconciliation attempts, and that my behavior had caused Patricia significant emotional distress during her final months. Each statement was technically accurate in its individual facts, but completely dishonest in its overall picture. Yes, I'd withdrawn financial support after 15 years and nearly $200,000 of unacknowledged assistance. Yes, I'd limited Connor's contact after Victoria violated clearly stated boundaries. Yes, I'd been absent from most family gatherings because they'd been used to pressure and manipulate me. The petition requested that the court review Eleanor's will and redistribute assets equally among all 3 siblings in accordance with principles of fairness and family harmony, as Eleanor Mitchell would have intended had she known of Sarah Mitchell's subsequent abandonment of family relationships. I drove straight to Jennifer's office. She read through the entire petition with the detached focus of a professional making notes in the margins, occasionally nodding or raising an eyebrow. When she finished, she looked up at me with an expression that was almost satisfied. They've made several specific factual claims we can disprove with documentation, the financial withdrawal being sudden and unexplained. We have 15 years of records and their thank you emails that prove it was neither sudden nor unexplained. The refusal to allow reasonable contact. We have your emails offering supervised visits all declined. The limited presence during hospice care. We have documentation that you were blocked from information about her care until the final week. Jennifer set the petition down and folded her hands. Victoria just gave us exactly the opening we needed. She's committed to specific claims under oath. Now we prove them false and her entire case collapses. The court-ordered mediation was scheduled for 2 weeks after the petition was filed. Jennifer had explained that judges in estate disputes almost always required mediation, first hoping to avoid lengthy and expensive litigation. Most of these cases settle in mediation once people realize what their evidence actually looks like under scrutiny, she'd said. The courthouse mediation room was deliberately neutral, designed to feel less adversarial than a courtroom, but still formal enough to remind everyone this was a legal proceeding. A long conference table dominated the space with Sarah and Jennifer on one side, Victoria, Aunt Linda, and their attorney, Mr. Brennan, on the other. The mediator, Ms. Park, sat at the head of the table with her legal pad and a box of tissues conspicuously placed within reach. Ms. Park was a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and the calm demeanor of someone who'd mediated hundreds of family disputes. She explained the process in a measured tone. Each side would present their case without interruption, then we'd explore potential settlement options. Nothing said here was admissible in court unless we reached an agreement. The goal was resolution, not warfare. Victoria went first, and I had to admit her presentation was compelling. She'd clearly prepared, possibly rehearsed. Her voice carried just the right mixture of pain and concern as she walked through what she characterized as my abandonment. Sarah cut off all financial support to our mother without warning or explanation in January. Victoria began consulting notes. Patricia had been relying on that support for years to manage her expenses. When Mom asked Sarah why Sarah refused to discuss it, she paused, letting that land. Then Sarah removed me from her son Connor's school contact list, preventing me from seeing my nephew or being available in case of emergency. When I tried to visit Connor at school out of concern, Sarah characterized it as some kind of violation, rather than what it was a worried aunt checking on her nephew. Aunt Linda dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Victoria continued. During our mother's final months when she was dying of cancer, Sarah refused repeated invitations to family dinners, declined to participate in coordinating Mom's care, and visited her exactly once during her entire hospice stay. Once. While I was there every single day managing medications, coordinating with nurses, making sure Mom wasn't alone. Victoria's voice caught slightly. My sister died heartbroken that Sarah had pulled away. She spent her final weeks asking why Sarah was so angry, what she'd done to deserve being abandoned by her daughter. The performance was polished and devastating. I could see Ms. Park taking notes, her expression neutral but engaged. Mr. Brennan looked confident, like a lawyer who believed his case was strong. Then it was our turn. Jennifer didn't get emotional. She didn't appeal to sympathy or paint me as a victim. She simply presented facts methodically, like the experienced litigator she was. Let's address the financial support first. Jennifer slid printed bank statements across the table. These records document $198,000 in direct support to Patricia Mitchell and Victoria Morrison over 15 years. This was not a recent relationship. It was a long-term financial dependency. When Sarah ceased automatic transfers in January, it was after 15 years of continuous, unacknowledged support. She pulled out the next document. Regarding Connor's access to family, here are emails from Sarah to both Patricia and Victoria, offering supervised visits at neutral locations. January 15th. Happy to bring Connor to the park Saturday for an hour. Declined. February 3rd. Connor and I can visit Sunday afternoon 2-3 p.m. at your house if I can stay present. Declined. March 8th. Another offer. Also declined. Mr. Brennan shifted uncomfortably. Victoria's expression remained fixed. The school incident. Jennifer produced the formal report. Sarah sent written notice to the school on March 2nd, explicitly removing Victoria Morrison from approved contacts. On March 12th, Victoria attempted to remove Connor from campus without authorization. The school counselor documented this. Victoria claimed a family emergency that did not exist. Then Jennifer pulled out her laptop and a small speaker. Finally, I have a recording made by Daniel Mitchell in November of last year. Victoria Morrison and Marcus Morrison discussing estate strategy. She pressed play. Victoria's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. Once she's cut out of the will or forced to split it, we'll have enough for the down payment on the lake house. Mom agrees the inheritance should be split equally since Sarah has been distant lately. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched Mr. Brennan's face, carefully saw the moment he realized his clients had not been entirely forthcoming with him. He closed his folder and sat back, professional composure barely hiding his frustration. But Jennifer wasn't done. She looked at me and nodded. This was my part. I stood, my hands resting on the table. My voice was steady, calm, none of the emotion I was feeling underneath. I protected my son from the same pattern that damaged me, damaged Victoria, and went back at least to my grandmother Eleanor. Victoria didn't lose custody of Lucas because his father was vindictive. She lost it because a family court found evidence of emotional abuse, excessive criticism, isolation, manipulation. I have those court records obtained legally through Lucas himself, who is now 14, and contacted me voluntarily. He gave permission to unseal them if necessary to protect Connor. Victoria shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You contacted my son. You turned my own child against me. I met her eyes calmly. No, Victoria. He found me. To thank me for protecting Connor the way no one protected him. Ms. Park called for a recess immediately after Victoria's outburst. She requested that the attorneys meet with her separately in another room, leaving Sarah, Victoria, and Aunt Linda sitting in uncomfortable silence on opposite sides of the conference table. When Jennifer returned 20 minutes later, her expression was carefully neutral, but I could read the slight satisfaction in her eyes. Ms. Park has strongly recommended that both parties consider settlement. She's being very direct with Mr. Brennan about the weaknesses in their petition. We moved to a smaller conference room down the hall. Jennifer closed the door and turned to me. We can push for everything, Sarah. Full sanctions against them for filing a frivolous petition, make them pay your legal fees, potentially pursue defamation claims for the statements they made about you at the funeral and in the petition. We could destroy Victoria's credibility completely. She paused. Or we can settle this quietly and be done with it. What do you want? I thought about Lucas's message about Victoria's children who were already suffering the consequences of their mother's choices. I thought about the cycle of pain that had been passed down through generations and what breaking it actually meant. I want to settle, I said, but on specific terms. The terms I proposed surprised even Jennifer. I would accept the full inheritance as Eleanor had designated it, but I would voluntarily gift $50,000 to Daniel in recognition of his support and his own journey through this family dysfunction. Another $50,000 would be split equally between Victoria's children, Emily and Jason, placed in educational trusts they could access at 18. The money would be held by an independent trustee, not Victoria. Victoria doesn't get a penny, I said firmly, but her children aren't punished for her choices. Aunt Linda gets nothing because she joined this petition without doing her own research, without asking me directly what happened. And in exchange, Victoria signs a binding agreement, no contact with Connor except through me until he's 18, and can decide for himself whether he wants a relationship with her. Jennifer presented the terms to Mr. Brennan. An hour passed while they negotiated in Victoria's private conference room. I could hear raised voices through the door at one point, Victoria's most prominently. Finally, they emerged. Victoria's face was blotchy, her mascara smudged. Mr. Brennan looked like a man who'd just prevented his client from making a catastrophic mistake. We gathered back at the mediation table to sign the settlement documents. Ms. Park witnessed each signature, her expression professionally neutral, but perhaps slightly relieved that this wouldn't be going to trial. Victoria signed last, her hand shaking slightly. As she set down the pen, she looked at me with something raw and broken in her expression. You won. Are you happy now? I met her eyes calmly. This isn't about winning, Victoria. This is about stopping the pattern, stopping the manipulation, stopping the cycle that hurt all of us. I hope someday you understand that. Victoria didn't respond. She gathered her things and left with Aunt Linda and Mr. Brennan trailing behind them. I walked out of the courthouse into bright afternoon sunshine, Jennifer beside me, discussing next steps for finalizing the trust documents. My phone buzzed with a text as we reached the parking lot. It was from Lucas. I heard what happened. Thank you for not destroying her completely. She's still my mom, even if she's a bad one. 6 months passed with a quietness that felt almost surreal after the intensity of the legal battle. Summer arrived, then faded into fall, and I found myself experiencing something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the absence of problems, but the presence of stability built on my own terms. Connor turned 9 in September, and the transformation in him over the past year was remarkable. His anxiety, which had been a constant companion since Christmas a year ago, had decreased significantly with regular therapy and the absence of family members who made him feel perpetually inadequate. His art had evolved in ways that made my heart sing. The dark, precise drawings of suffering had given way to colorful, imaginative scenes, robots building cities, dragons befriending children, fantastical landscapes filled with joy and possibility. He'd made real friends at school, joined the robotics club where he was apparently thriving, and had developed this wonderful ability to talk openly about his feelings. Just last week he'd told me matter-of-factly that he was nervous about a math test but knew he'd be okay because being nervous doesn't mean I'm not prepared, it just means I care. One evening in October, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Connor asked if I ever thought about Grandma Patricia or Aunt Victoria. I'd been expecting this question eventually. Sometimes I miss the idea of having a grandma and aunt who love me, he said, his voice thoughtful, mature beyond his years. But I don't miss feeling like I was always doing something wrong, like nothing I did was ever good enough. The clarity in his statement was both heartbreaking and affirming. He understood in his own way what had happened and why we'd made the choices we made. Daniel had become an integral part of our lives in a way that felt healthy and sustainable. He showed up for Connor's robotics competitions, taught him basic coding on weekend afternoons, listened without judgment when Connor wanted to talk about difficult things. He was the kind of uncle every kid deserved, present, supportive, never demanding more than Connor was ready to give. I'd also found my own support system. A group for adult children of dysfunctional families met twice a month at a community center, and I'd connected with people who understood the specific pain of loving family members who'd harmed you, of grieving relationships that never existed. One of those people was Tom, a therapist whose own family experiences had led him to his profession. We'd been dating for 3 months, taking things slowly, both of us cautious but hopeful. The inheritance had been finalized in August. I paid off my mortgage completely, invested the bulk of the remainder in conservative funds for Connor's future, and made a donation of $25,000 to a nonprofit supporting children affected by parental abuse. The financial freedom wasn't about luxury or extravagance. It was about autonomy, the ability to say no without anxiety, to make choices based on values, rather than obligation, to give Connor experiences without the constant calculation of whether I could afford it. Money, I'd learned, wasn't power. Autonomy was. I was sorting through mail one November afternoon when I found a letter that had been forwarded from my old address. The envelope was institutional, the kind used by correctional facilities. The return address showed a women's prison 2 states away. The sender's name made me pause: Ruth Mitchell, Eleanor's sister. The aunt I'd never met, whose existence I'd only learned about from family whispers and gaps in photo albums. I opened Ruth's letter standing at my kitchen counter. Connor doing homework at the table behind me. The handwriting was shaky, but legible, the kind that comes with age and perhaps limited practice. "Dear Sarah," it began. "You don't know me, but I'm your grandmother Eleanor's younger sister. I'm writing from where I've been for the past 8 years, a women's correctional facility in Idaho, serving time for embezzlement I committed trying to escape an abusive marriage. My granddaughter Emily saw something online about a book being written by Daniel Mitchell about growing up in the Mitchell family. She knows our history and thought I should reach out to you." I sat down slowly, reading on. "There are things about our family you should know, things that might help you understand where this all started. Eleanor and I grew up during the Depression in rural Montana. Our father was an alcoholic who couldn't keep work. Our mother developed a survival strategy, harsh discipline, and complete emotional withholding. She believed that if we children didn't cry, didn't complain, didn't show our hunger or cold or fear, our father wouldn't drink as much. She thought he drank to escape our needs, our weakness, as she called it." The letter continued in Ruth's shaky script. Eleanor internalized this as life philosophy. She genuinely believed that hardship built character, that comfort made people weak, that love should be conditional on strength. I rejected it. I left home at 16, which is why the family never spoke of me, why you didn't know I existed. I tried to warn Eleanor when Patricia was young that she was repeating the pattern, that what worked for survival in the Depression wasn't necessary or healthy in peacetime. She cut me off completely. Ruth's words hit me with unexpected force. "I'm writing now because I wanted you to know it goes back further than Eleanor. This sickness in our family has roots in genuine trauma, in a mother who thought she was saving her children by making them hard. But Sarah, trauma explains. It doesn't excuse. Each generation had a choice to heal or repeat. You chose healing. I'm proud of you, though I have no right to be never having met you." I read the letter 3 times before I could move. Then I called Dr. Morrison and asked for an emergency session. In her office 2 days later, I handed her Ruth's letter. She read it carefully, then set it down with that particular expression therapists get when something clinically significant has emerged. "How are you processing this?" she asked. "I don't know. It helps me understand Eleanor better. And Mom. Even Victoria." I struggled to find words. "But it also makes me angry." because understanding where it came from doesn't make what they did okay. Exactly right. Dr. Morrison leaned forward. Understanding the origin of abuse doesn't excuse it, Sarah. Your great-grandmother's harshness was survival, a desperate woman trying to manage an impossible situation with the tools she had. Your grandmother's was misguided philosophy. She took a survival strategy and turned it into a parenting principle. Your mother's was learned behavior. She internalized what she was taught and believed it was love. Victoria's is desperate compensation for her own failures, trying to prove the system works because admitting it would mean facing what she did to Lucas. She paused, making sure I was following. Each generation had a choice to heal or repeat. Your great-grandmother might not have had the resources or knowledge to choose differently. But Eleanor did. Patricia did. Victoria did. They chose to repeat. You chose to heal. Can I feel compassion for Eleanor as a child and still hold her accountable for what she did to my mother? Not only can you must. Empathy and boundaries aren't opposites, Sarah. They coexist. You can understand that Eleanor was a wounded child who grew into a wounding adult. Both things are true. That evening, I wrote back to Ruth. I thanked her for reaching out, for filling in the missing pieces, for being the person who chose differently. I told her about Connor, about the settlement, about Daniel's book. I asked if she'd be willing to have visitors. Her response came 2 weeks later, and it made me cry. I would be honored to meet the child who got what I fought for, a mother who chose to break the chain. I have 6 months left on my sentence, then I'll be released to a halfway house in Boise. If you're willing to make the trip before then, visiting hours are Saturdays 1-4 p.m. Bring Connor. Let me see what freedom looks like on a child's face. The letter included one more thing. A photograph, old and faded, the colors slightly off in the way of pictures from the 1950s. 2 young girls, maybe 8 and 6, standing in front of a farmhouse. The older one, Eleanor, was smiling, genuinely, smiling with brightness in her eyes that I'd never seen in any photo of her as an adult. She looked hopeful, open, unguarded. Before hardness became her armor. I stared at that photo for a long time, and when I looked in the mirror afterward, I saw something that made my breath catch. The shape of Eleanor's eyes in that childhood photo, the curve of her genuine smile, they were mine. The genetics of trauma visible in the bone structure of our faces, but not determinative of our choices. I had her eyes, but I wouldn't have her life. A year passed. Spring turned to summer, summer to fall, fall to winter again, and with each season I felt the weight of the past growing lighter, not disappearing, but becoming something I could carry without it defining every step. Daniel's book was published in March by a small press that specialized in family trauma memoirs and recovery narratives. The Inheritance of Silence didn't make any bestseller lists, didn't get reviewed in major newspapers, but it found exactly the audience it needed to find. Adult children of narcissists ordered it online. Therapists bought copies for their lending libraries. Support groups read it chapter by chapter, people recognizing their own families in the carefully disguised details. The book launch was held at an independent bookstore in Portland on a rainy Thursday evening. I sat in the third row with Connor on one side, Tom on the other, and Ruth beside him. She'd been released from prison 2 months earlier for good behavior and had chosen to relocate to Portland to be near family she'd never had the chance to know. At 84, she was frail but sharp, her eyes bright with the kind of wisdom that comes from surviving your own mistakes and choosing to learn from them. Daniel read from the final chapter, the one about breaking free, and when he reached the dedication, his voice caught slightly. To my sister Sarah, who taught me that the bravest thing a person can do is refuse to pass on pain. I cried, but they were different tears than I'd cried before. Not grief or anger or the complicated ache of loving people who'd hurt me. Just relief. Simple, clean relief that we'd made it through. Through Lucas, who'd become a regular presence in our lives via video calls and occasional visits, I learned that Victoria had started therapy. She was working part-time at a flower shop, living in a modest apartment after her divorce from Marcus was finalized. She'd joined a support group for parents who'd lost custody and was attempting slowly and with many setbacks to rebuild some kind of relationship with Emily and Jason. Lucas was cautiously optimistic but realistic. "She's trying," he'd told me over coffee last month. "I don't know if she'll ever really get it, but she's trying. That's more than she was doing before." Victoria hadn't reached out to me, and I hadn't reached out to her. Some relationships can't be salvaged, only grieved. I'd spent months in therapy learning to mourn not the mother and sister I'd had, but the mother and sister I'd never had, the family that had never existed outside my desperate childhood hopes. That grief was real and valid, and it coexisted with my relief at their absence from my daily life. I wished Victoria well from a distance. Not for her sake primarily, but for her children who deserved a mother capable of healing, and for Lucas who deserved the option of reconciliation someday if he chose it. On Connor's 10th birthday in September, I took him to visit Eleanor's grave for the first time. We'd written a letter together over the course of several evenings, Connor carefully choosing his words, me helping him articulate thoughts that were wise beyond his years. We stood at the headstone, just the two of us, and Connor read aloud in his clear, steady voice. "Dear Great-Grandma Eleanor, we learned that you tried to make people strong by making them survive hard things. But Mom taught me that real strength is choosing kindness even when you're strong enough to be cruel. We forgive you because hurt people, but we're not continuing it. This pattern ends with us. We're building something different, a family where love doesn't have to be earned, and where 'I'm proud of you' doesn't come with conditions. Thank you for giving Mom the resources to make this choice. Love, Connor and Sarah." We buried the letter in a small waterproof container at the base of the headstone. Connor placed a smooth river rock on top, a marker of closure and promise both. That night, after Connor was asleep, I wrote in my journal the final entry in a notebook I'd been keeping throughout this entire journey. I wrote it knowing that someday when Connor was older, I'd give it to him so he'd understand not just what happened, but why the choices I made mattered. "I used to think family was the people you're born to," I wrote. "Then I thought it was the people who deserve you. Now I know it's simpler and more complex than both family is the people who show up consistently with love that doesn't require you to shrink." I wrote about Eleanor's complicated legacy, about Victoria's card that had arrived through Lucas with just 2 words, "I'm trying." I wrote about Daniel's book helping strangers recognize their own pain, about Ruth writing her own memoir with my encouragement about Connor's art evolving into joyful expressions of freedom. I didn't win by destroying them, I wrote as my final thought. I won by refusing to let their inheritance of pain become Connor's. The inheritance Eleanor gave me wasn't money. It was choice. And I chose love without conditions, boundaries without guilt, and a future where Connor never has to stand in the cold wondering what he did wrong. This is how generational trauma dies, not with violence, but with a mother who says, "Not my child, not anymore, never again," and means it. I closed the journal and placed it in my desk drawer next to Connor's drawing from that terrible Christmas evidence of where we'd been and how far we'd come. Outside my window, the first stars were appearing in the clear autumn sky. Inside, my son slept peacefully, safe and loved and free. The cycle was broken. The pattern had ended. And tomorrow we'd wake up and continue building something new. And that's where Sarah's story reaches its conclusion, though. Of course, real healing is never truly complete. It's an ongoing journey, not a destination. Connor is 10 now, thriving and free. Sarah has built a life on her own terms, surrounded by people who love her without conditions. The cycle that started generations ago with a desperate mother during the Depression, that passed through Eleanor, through Patricia, through Victoria, has finally been broken. But I want to pause here and talk to you directly, because if you've made it this far in Sarah's story, there's a reason. Maybe you saw yourself in her journey. Maybe you recognized the pattern of being the family scapegoat, the one who gives and gives but never receives acknowledgement. Maybe you've experienced the particular pain of loving family members who've hurt you, of having to choose between your own well-being and the obligation you were taught to feel. Or perhaps you're watching this because you're trying to understand someone in your life who's going through something similar. Maybe you're a Victoria who's beginning to recognize the damage you've caused. Maybe you're a Daniel who's been watching from the sidelines and finally wants to take action. Wherever you are in your own story, I want you to know something important. You are not alone. The patterns Sarah experienced, this generational cycle of conditional love and emotional manipulation disguised as strength training, is far more common than most people realize. Thousands of families operate under similar dynamics, passing down trauma like a dark inheritance, convinced they're teaching resilience when they're actually teaching children to doubt themselves, to shrink to believe love must be earned through suffering. But here's the hope that Sarah's story offers us. The cycle can be broken. It takes courage. It takes support. It takes documentation and boundaries, and the willingness to be misunderstood by people whose opinions you were raised to prioritize above your own well-being. But it can be done. Sarah didn't destroy her family through revenge. She didn't win by being cruel or vindictive. She won by choosing to protect her son and herself, by refusing to pass on the pain that had been given to her. She won by understanding that real love doesn't require you to make yourself small, that healthy families don't operate on fear and obligation, that you can grieve what you never had while building something better. Now, I want to hear from you because your voice matters in this conversation. Have you experienced similar family dynamics? Have you been the Sarah in your own family story, the one who had to set boundaries that others saw as betrayal? Or maybe you've been the Daniel watching these patterns play out and struggling with whether to speak up? Perhaps some of you have recognized yourself in Victoria's struggle, seeing patterns in your own parenting that you want to change. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Share your story if you feel safe doing so. Let's create a community here where people can recognize they're not alone, where we can support each other in breaking these cycles. Sometimes just knowing that someone else understands that your experience is valid can be the first step toward healing. And if Sarah's story resonated with you, if it helped you see your own situation more clearly, or gave you hope that change is possible, please consider subscribing to this channel. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we share stories like this regularly. Stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. Stories about choosing healing over hatred. Stories about the quiet courage it takes to build a better life. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe you know a Sarah who's struggling to set boundaries with toxic family members. Maybe you know a Connor who's being raised in a household where love comes with conditions. This story might be exactly what they need to understand they deserve better. Leave a like if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it gave you something valuable. The algorithm rewards engagement, and the more people interact with videos like this, the more people YouTube will show it to, which means more Sarahs out there will find the validation and hope they need. I also want to ask you this, and please be honest in the comments. What part of Sarah's journey hit you the hardest? Was it the moment she found that childhood photograph and realized the abuse was generational? Was it Connor's drawing showing Victoria's satisfied smile? Was it Patricia's deathbed recognition that came too late? Or was it the final scene at Eleanor's grave where Connor and Sarah together chose to end the cycle? Tell me what resonated with you, because understanding what strikes a chord helps me create more content that serves this community better. Remember, if you're in a situation like Sarah's, please seek professional help. Talk to a therapist who specializes in family systems and trauma. Document everything. Build your support network. You don't have to do this alone, and you don't have to do it all at once. Healing is a journey, and every small step toward protecting yourself and your children matters. Thank you for watching Sarah's story all the way through. Thank you for being part of this community. And remember, the bravest thing you can do is refuse to pass on pain. You have that power. You always have. Until next time, choose healing. Choose boundaries. Choose yourself.